The Children of the Shadows. Hello, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Nightfall. Tonight we travel somewhere remote, somewhere forgotten, somewhere the silence holds its breath. Waiting, we journey to a place built on the bones of good intentions and paved with secrets dark enough to swallow the light whole. Close your eyes, if you dare. Let the sounds paint the picture. The whisper of wind through skeletal trees, the groan of old timber settling deeper into cursed earth. We are approaching St. Augustine's orphanage, and tonight, I bring you a story called The Children of the Shadows. The drive itself felt like shedding layers of the known world. Eleanor Vance gripped the steering wheel of her aging sedan, knuckles white. Not from fear, not yet, but from the sheer concentration required to navigate the increasingly treacherous road. Paved highways had given way to gravel tracks hours ago, and now, the gravel itself was surrendering to little more than packed earth, deeply rutted and slick with a persistent, unseen dampness despite the weak autumn sun filtering through the dense canopy overhead. The forest crowded the road, ancient oaks and pines leaning in as if sharing conspiratorial whispers, their branches interlaced like arthritic fingers, blotting out the sky. Her GPS had blinked out 50 miles back. The printed map, stained with coffee and worry, lay open on the passenger seat, depicting this final stretch as a vague squiggle leading to a start. Solitary. Marked St. Augustine's. Isolated. That was the word the agency file had used. Understated, Eleanor thought grimly. This wasn't isolation, it was exile. A place you sent things you wanted to disappear. And children, apparently. Eleanor was a social worker, relatively new to this rural district, transferred from the bustling chaos of Chicago. She'd seen hardship, neglect, the quiet desperation in the eyes of children let down by the world. She carried folders filled with case files, regulations, and a stubborn, perhaps naive, belief in second chances. St. Augustine's had fallen under her purview due to a bureaucratic reshuffling, an anomaly on the fringes of her assigned territory. Decades old, privately funded by dwindling anonymous donations, it existed outside the usual state systems, a relic operating under its own strange inertia. Reports were sparse, inspections rarer. The file mentioned a handful of long-term residents, children deemed unplaceable, under the sole care of a matron Hemlock. Eleanor's mission was simple: assess the current conditions, ensure compliance with basic welfare standards, and, ideally, identify any children who might be suitable for foster placement, despite the unplaceable tag. A long shot, her supervisor had admitted, but necessary. The place had flown under the radar for too long. The trees finally broke, revealing a clearing shrouded in mist that clung stubbornly to the ground even in the afternoon light. And there it stood. St. Augustine's. It wasn't welcoming. Victorians sometimes possessed a certain morbid charm, but this structure seemed actively hostile. A sprawling, three-story edifice of blackened timber and gray, weathered stone, it sagged under the weight of its own history. Gables like angry eyebrows jutted from the steep, moss-covered roof. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared out from the shadows beneath deep eaves. Many were boarded up. Others reflected the gray sky with dull indifference. A wrought iron fence, rusted and partially collapsed, encircled the grounds, less a boundary than the crumbling teeth of some ancient beast. Weeds choked what might have once been gardens. A single, skeletal swing set stood motionless in the damp air. Silence. That was the first thing that struck Eleanor as she switched off the engine. Not the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but a heavy, oppressive silence. No birdsong, no distant traffic, just the sigh of the wind through the pines at the edge of the clearing and the unnerving stillness emanating from the house itself. It felt watchful. She took a deep breath, grabbing her briefcase and the worn map. Plastering on a professional smile she didn't feel, she pushed open the car door. The air was cold, carrying the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and something else, something metallic, and faintly unpleasant like old blood or rust. The iron gate groaned in protest as she pushed it open. The path to the front door was cracked flagstone, slick with moss. As she approached, the massive oak door, banded with black iron, seemed to loom larger, more forbidding. There was no bell, only a heavy iron knocker shaped like a raven, its beak worn smooth by time or touch. Hesitantly, Eleanor lifted it and let it fall. The sound echoed, unnaturally loud in the stillness, before being swallowed by the house. Silence returned. She waited. 1 minute. 2. Long enough for the chill in the air to seep in her coat. Long enough for the isolation to feel less like a location and more like a condition. She raised the knocker again, rapping more firmly this time. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from deep within the house. Not the hurried steps of someone expecting a visitor, but the measured tread of something else. The sound scraped against Eleanor's nerves. A bolt slid back with a grating screech of metal on metal. Another followed. Then the door creaked open, just a sliver, revealing a slice of profound darkness within. A face appeared in the gap. Old, deeply lined, framed by severe gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin taut over sharp cheekbones. Eyes, the color of faded slate, regarded Eleanor without curiosity, without welcome. They were ancient eyes, holding a weariness that went beyond age. Yes, the voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together. "Matron Hemlock?" Eleanor asked, trying to keep her tone bright, professional. "I'm Eleanor Vance, from the County Social Services. I believe you were expecting me." The woman, Matron Hemlock, didn't answer immediately. Her gaze swept over Eleanor, lingering for a moment on the briefcase, then drifting past her towards the encroaching woods. The silence stretched again, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke, her voice devoid of inflection. "The county remembers us, then, after all this time. Come in, Miss Vance. The children are waiting." She opened the door wider, stepping back into the Stygian gloom of the entrance hall. It wasn't an invitation offered warmly, but a statement of fact, heavy with unspoken implications. As Eleanor stepped over the threshold, out of the weak sunlight and into the oppressive shadow of St. Augustine's, the heavy oak door swung shut behind her with a deep, resonant thud. The bolts slid back into place, locking her inside. The air within was colder still, thick with the smell of dust, beeswax, and that faint, unsettling metallic tang. And beneath it all, was that the cloying sweetness of decay, or something else entirely? Eleanor clutched her briefcase tighter. Her assessment had begun, but already a cold dread was coiling in her stomach. Something was wrong here, terribly wrong. The silence wasn't empty. It was listening, and the children were waiting. Chapter 1, Where Lost Things Gather. The great oak door boomed shut, the sound echoing down the cavernous hallway like a final judgment. The click of the heavy bolts sliding home felt unervingly definitive, sealing Eleanor Vance inside the oppressive embrace of St. Augustine's orphanage. The immediate plunge into near darkness was disorienting after the weak, gray light outside. High, narrow windows near the vaulted ceiling offered little illumination, their glass filmed with decades of grime. Dust motes danced lethargically in the few stray beams, the only sign of movement in the suffocating stillness. The air was tomb-cold, stagnant, thick with the cloying perfume of beeswax polish layered over underlying notes of damp plaster, decay, and that persistent, faint metallic tang that prickled the back of Eleanor's throat. It wasn't the smell of a well-kept, albeit old, institution. It smelled of secrets left to fester. Matron Hemlock stood silhouetted against the faint light filtering from deeper within the house. She hadn't offered to take Eleanor's coat, hadn't made any gesture of welcome beyond the curt command to enter. Her posture was ramrod straight, her presence filling the space far more than her gaunt frame should have allowed. She turned, her slate-gray eyes fixing on Eleanor with an unnerving intensity. The county sends someone at last. She repeated, her voice a dry rustle. We had begun to think we were entirely forgotten. A blessing, perhaps. The world outside has little understanding of the needs of these children. The emphasis on these was subtle but distinct, setting them apart, branding them as something other. Eleanor tightened her grip on her briefcase. The smooth leather is small, grounding comfort. My apologies if the visit feels overdue, matron. Bureaucracy can be slow. My aim is simply to ensure the children are receiving adequate care and to see if any might be suitable for potential placement. A sound that might have been a dry chuckle escaped the matron's thin lips, devoid of humor. Placement. She tilted her head, the movement bird-like and unsettling. Miss Vance, the children here are not suitable. They are wards of St. Augustine's. They belong here, with us, with the shadows that understand them. Shadows? An odd turn of phrase. Eleanor forced her professional smile back into place. Every child deserves a chance at a family life, matron. Our goal is always reunification or finding a loving foster home. Love? Matron Hemlock's gaze sharpened, cutting through the gloom. Love is a fragile thing, Miss Vance. Easily broken. These children require something more resilient. Discipline, structure, and protection from a world that would not comprehend their sensitivities. She gestured vaguely down the long, dark corridor stretching before them. Culme, wasting daylight. What little penetrates these walls? She began to walk, her steps measured and almost silent on the dark. Warped floorboards beneath a threadbare runner rug, whose pattern had long faded into obscurity. Eleanor followed, her own heels clicking awkwardly into profound quiet, feeling like an intruder in a place that actively resented her presence. The walls were paneled in dark wood, scarred and gouged in places, rising to meet a high ceiling obscured by shadows. An enormous, dust-shrouded grandfather clock stood frozen at 3:30 against one wall, its pendulum still, its silence adding to the mausoleum-like atmosphere. A few framed pictures hung crookedly, stern-faced men and women in archaic clothing, perhaps founders or previous benefactors, their painted eyes seeming to follow Eleanor's progress down the hall. There was no sign of childish clutter, no brightly colored drawings taped to the walls, no scattered toys, none of the usual chaotic charm of a place inhabited by young lives. It was unervingly tidy, unnaturally sterile. As they moved deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop further. Eleanor shivered, pulling her blazer tighter. They passed several closed doors, dark, heavy wood identical to the front entrance. From behind one, she thought she heard a faint sound, a rhythmic soft thump, 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 like a small ball being bounced gently against a wall. But it stopped abruptly as they drew level with the door, plunging that section of the corridor back into absolute silence. Goosebumps prickled on her arms. The children are usually occupied with their lessons at this hour, Matron Hemlock stated, though she hadn't looked back. It felt less like an explanation and more like a preemptive dismissal of any questions Eleanor might have about the lack of visible activity. We maintain a strict routine. Routine is essential for their stability. What kind of lessons do they have? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her voice even. The fundamentals. Reading, penmanship, scripture, of course, and other specialized studies. The matron didn't elaborate, her tone discouraging further inquiry. They reached a slightly wider area where the main corridor intersected with another. Here, the metallic smell was stronger, mingling unpleasantly with the scent of stale disinfectant. A single, bare bulb hung from a long cord overhead, casting a sickly yellow light that did little to dispel the gloom, only deepening the shadows in the corners. On the wall, low down, almost at floor level, Eleanor noticed a series of crude drawings scratched directly into the dark wood paneling. They weren't the typical stick figures or smiling sons of childhood art. These were jagged, abstract shapes, spirals that seemed to writhe, and distorted figures with too many limbs or eyes that were merely dark, empty sockets. They were deeply unsettling, filled with a frantic, almost desperate energy. Children express themselves in unique ways, Matron Hemlock said, noticing Eleanor's gaze. Her voice held a warning note. Their inner worlds are complex. Eleanor knelt for a closer look, ignoring the matron's implied disapproval. The scratches were deep, gouged into the wood with force. Some seemed disturbingly fresh, running a hesitant finger over one of the jagged spirals. She felt an unexpected, unnatural coldness radiating from the wood itself, a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She snatched her hand back, rubbing her fingers together. Are they allowed to draw on the walls? Eleanor asked, standing up, trying to sound merely curious. They have their moments, the matron replied evasively. Impulses arise. We manage them. She turned towards a wider, arched doorway at the end of the intersecting hall. The refectory. They will be finishing their midday meal soon. Perhaps you can observe them there, from a distance. Initially, they could be startled by new faces. Observe them, like specimens in a zoo. The thought made Eleanor deeply uncomfortable. She followed the matron towards the archway, the sense of dread intensifying with each step. The air flowing from the upcoming room felt heavy, carrying not the smell of food, but that same cold. Stagnant air mixed with something else, something vaguely organic and unpleasant she couldn't quite identify. The faint, rhythmic thumping sound started again, seemingly coming from a room beyond the archway, accompanied now by a low, indistinct humming, a melody-less drone produced by multiple voices in unison. It wasn't singing, it was vibration, a sound that resonated not in the ears, but in the chest cavity, unsettling her on a primal level. Matron Hemlock paused just before the threshold, turning back to Eleanor. Her eyes, in the dim light, seemed almost luminous, reflecting the sickly yellow bulb overhead. Remember, Miss Vance, she whispered, her voice barely audible but charged with intensity. These are not ordinary children. They have seen things, felt things. They carry the shadows within them. Do not provoke them. Do not pity them. Simply observe. With that cryptic warning, she pushed open the heavy, swinging door, revealing the room where the children of the shadows waited. The refectory was cavernous and cold, echoing the austere, unwelcoming spirit of the rest of St. Augustine's. Long, scarred wooden tables, devoid of cloths or any decoration, stretched in parallel lines across the room, flanked by hard benches. The only light came from tall, arched windows set high in the walls, their grimy panes depicting faded biblical scenes, martyrs and suffering saints, casting distorted, gloomy patterns on the stone floor. The air hung heavy with the same chill as the hallway, overlaid now with the smell of boiled cabbage and that persistent, faint metallic tang, sharper here, almost coppery. There was no warmth, no chatter, no clatter of cutlery against plates, none of the expected sounds of a children's dining hall. Instead, there was only the low, guttural humming Eleanor had heard earlier, a monotonous, multi-tone drone that seemed to emanate from the very core of the children seated there, and the soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. About a dozen children were present, scattered sparsely along the benches, leaving significant gaps between them. They ranged in apparent age from perhaps 6 or 7 to early teens, though assigning age felt strangely difficult. There was an ageless quality to their stillness, their solemnity. All were dressed in drab, uniform-like clothing, gray woolen jumpers over plain shirts, dark trousers or skirts. Their faces were uniformly pale, almost luminous in the dim light, and their hair, regardless of color, shades of dishwater blonde, dull brown, or stark black, was cut short and severe, emphasizing the starkness of their features. They sat unnaturally straight, their hands resting palms down on the tabletop beside plain, chipped ceramic bowls containing a pale, unappetizing stew. They didn't look up as Eleanor and Matron Hemlock entered. Their heads remained bowed slightly, their eyes fixed on some indeterminate point on the table before them. The humming continued unabated. a collective vibration that made Eleanor's teeth ache slightly. The thumping sound, she now realized, came from a boy sitting near the far end of the closest table. He was methodically tapping his forehead against the edge of the wooden table, a soft, dull impact repeated with unnerving regularity. Thump, thump, thump. He showed no sign of pain or distress. It seemed an entirely mechanical action, as ingrained as breathing. Children, Matron Hemlock's voice cut through the humming, though she didn't raise it significantly. The sound was still sharp enough to command attention in the oppressive quiet. We have a visitor. Miss Vance from the county. Slowly, unnervingly in unison, the children lifted their heads. 12 pairs of eyes turned towards Eleanor. They were large, dark eyes, startlingly so against their pale skin. But it wasn't just their size or color that was unsettling. It was their emptiness. They held no curiosity, no shyness, no hostility, just a flat, vacant intensity, like polished stones reflecting the gloom. They looked at her, but not into her. It felt like being assessed by something ancient and indifferent. The humming didn't stop, but its pitch seemed to modulate slightly, taking on a questioning, almost discordant note. The boy at the end of the table ceased his rhythmic thumping, his forehead resting against the wood, his dark eyes fixed on Eleanor from beneath a fringe of lank black hair. Eleanor forced herself to smile, the gesture feeling brittle and false on her face. "Hello, everyone," she said, her voice sounding too loud, too cheerful in the heavy silence. "It's nice to meet you all." There was no response. No ismaios, no SHY glances, no fidgeting. Just the unwavering, collective stare and the low, resonant hum that seemed to thrum in the very air around them. Matron Hemlock stood beside Eleanor, her hands clasped loosely before her, observing the scene with an air of detached satisfaction, like a biologist observing a successful, albeit strange, colony. "They are reserved," the matron offered quietly, though her eyes remained on the children, a faint, almost indiscernible curve to her lips. "They do not warm quickly to outsiders. Their world is here." Eleanor scanned the faces, searching for any spark of typical childhood emotion. Near the center of one table sat a girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, smaller than the others, with wispy brown hair framing a heart-shaped face. Unlike the others, her eyes weren't entirely fixed on Eleanor. They flickered occasionally towards the grimy window, towards the distorted image of a saint bleeding light onto the floor. Her fingers, resting on the table, twitched slightly, tracing invisible patterns on the scarred wood, patterns that looked disturbingly similar to the jagged spirals Eleanor had seen scratched into the hallway wall. This must be Lila, Eleanor guessed, remembering a brief mention in the sparse file of a younger girl prone to imaginative episodes. The humming seemed slightly stronger around her, a low thrum originating deep in her chest. A few seats down from Lila sat the boy who had been hitting his head. He was older, maybe 13 or 14, with sharp features and an unnerving stillness now that his rhythmic tapping had ceased. His black hair fell partially over one eye, but the visible one burned with a cold, watchful intelligence that seemed far older than his years. He wasn't just looking at Eleanor. He was dissecting her, his gaze sharp and penetrating. There was a subtle tension in his shoulders, a coiled energy beneath the placid surface. The file had mentioned a Silas, noted for periods of intense focus and withdrawal. This had to be him. He held Eleanor's gaze for a moment longer than the others, a flicker of something unreadable. Calculation? Malice? Before his eyes dropped back to his bowl, dismissing her. "They have finished their meal," Matron Hemlock announced, though most bowls still seemed half full of the gray, lumpy stew. "It is time for their quiet period before afternoon studies." As if on cue, the children began to rise, again with that unsettling synchronicity. Chairs scraped softly on the stone floor, the sound jarring after the prolonged quiet. They moved without instruction, forming a loose line towards the doorway opposite the one Eleanor had entered through. Their movements were fluid but oddly deliberate, lacking the natural clumsiness or energy of typical children. They walked with their heads slightly bowed, their eyes downcast, the collective humming fading slightly as they moved away. Though it never ceased entirely, Silas glanced back once, his dark eye fixing on Eleanor for a fleeting second before he disappeared through the doorway. Lila trailed near the end of the line, her small hand briefly touching the cold stone wall as she passed, her fingers tracing one of the distorted patterns of light from the window. Then she too was gone, leaving the refectory feeling even colder and emptier than before. The rhythmic thumping was replaced by a profound, ringing silence. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her heart was pounding against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Every instinct, honed by years of working with vulnerable children, screamed that something was fundamentally, horrifically wrong here. This wasn't neglect in the conventional sense, not the chaos and desperation she was used to. This was something else, something structured, controlled, and deeply unnatural. Impressive discipline, Eleanor managed, aiming for neutrality, though her voice trembled slightly. Matron Hemlock turned her slate-gray eyes back to Eleanor. The faint hint of a smile remained. Discipline is survival here, Miss Vance. Structure is their anchor in the currents they navigate. They are not like other children. Their needs are unique. Their perceptions different. Different how? Eleanor pressed, pushing past the matron's evasiveness. The file mentioned sensitivities, but this, she gestured toward the empty tables, the lingering chill. They seem almost detached. The humming, the boy hitting his head. Silas finds rhythm soothing. The matron interrupted smoothly. A way to center himself. And the humming, it is their way. A connection. A harmony you wouldn't understand. Her tone was mild, but the underlying message was clear. You are an outsider. You cannot comprehend. Lila, the small one you noticed. She is particularly attuned to the echoes of this place. Echoes? The word sent another shiver down Eleanor's spine. Matron, I need to be frank. My assessment requires more than observation. I need to review records, see their sleeping quarters, perhaps speak to some of the children individually. Speak to them. Matron Hemlock's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Miss Vance, direct interaction can be disruptive. They exist in a delicate balance. Your presence is already a disturbance. Questions can unsettle them, dredge up things best left undisturbed. Things? What things? Eleanor felt a surge of frustration, mixed with a growing fear. Are they traumatized? Is that what you mean by sensitivities? Trauma is a human affliction, Miss Vance. The matron said softly, her voice dropping lower, becoming almost conspiratorial. She stepped closer, invading Eleanor's personal space. The scent of beeswax and something else, something cold and earthen, like disturbed soil, emanated from her. These children, they are beyond such simple definitions. They are vessels. They are listeners. They hear the whispers in the walls, the memories in the stones. They feel the shadows gathering outside. She gestured vaguely towards the grimy windows. Your world, with its noise and its fleeting emotions, it frightens them. It could break them. Or worse. Worse? Eleanor felt trapped between her professional duty and a primal urge to flee. The matron's words, her unnerving calmness, the children's vacant stares, it all painted a picture far darker than the dilapidated orphanage itself. I still need to see the records, matron. And the facilities. It's non-negotiable. For a long moment, Matron Hemlock simply stared at her, her eyes unblinking, assessing. Eleanor held her ground, refusing to be intimidated, though her palms were sweating. Finally, the matron gave a stiff nod. Very well. The records are in the study. But tread carefully, Miss Vance. St. Augustine's guards its secrets jealously. And its children, they are its most precious, most dangerous secret of all. She turned and walked towards the main corridor, leaving Eleanor alone in the vast, cold refectory. The silence pressing in, heavy with the echoes of the children's unsettling hum and the memory of their empty eyes. The assessment had barely begun, but Eleanor already knew this was unlike anything she had ever faced. She wasn't just evaluating an orphanage. She was stepping into the heart of a nightmare. Leaving the echoing cold of the refectory felt like surfacing momentarily from icy water, only to find the air equally frigid and unwelcoming. Eleanor followed Matron Hemlock back into the main intersecting corridor, the sickly yellow bulb overhead casting their elongated shadows onto the dark wood paneling. The silence that had resettled felt heavier now, charged with the memory of those vacant stairs and the unsettling, resonant hum. Eleanor glanced again at the crude symbols scratched into the wood near the floor, the writhing spirals, the multi-limbed figures. They seemed more menacing now, less like random vandalism and more like sigils, warnings scrawled in a language of pure dread. Had Lila's fingers traced these same shapes? The thought sent a fresh wave of unease through her. "The study is this way," Matron Hemlock stated, her voice flat, pulling Eleanor's attention forward. She led the way down another stretch of the main corridor, this one even dimmer than the first. The few high windows offering mere slivers of the gray afternoon. Water stains mapped the ceiling like continents on some forgotten, decaying world. The metallic tang persisted, but here it mingled with the dry, papery scent of old books and something else, something acrid and sharp, like ozone or static electricity. Eleanor could almost feel the air crackling around her, charged with a strange energy. They passed more closed doors, each one seemingly identical, each one radiating a palpable sense of stillness, as if holding its breath. From behind one, Eleanor heard a faint, skittering sound, like tiny claws scrabbling frantically on wood, but it ceased instantly as they approached, vanishing back into the profound silence. She didn't dare ask. Every sound, every detail in this place seemed designed to unnerve, to suggest horrors lurking just beyond the veil of perception. Matron Hemlock stopped before a door slightly less imposing than the others, though still made of heavy, dark oak. It bore a simple, tarnished brass plaque that read "Study." She produced a large, old-fashioned iron key from a pocket hidden within the folds of her severe gray dress and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a series of loud, protesting clicks before the door swung inward, opening into a room that was both orderly and deeply unsettling. The study was dominated by a massive, dark wood desk, its surface meticulously tidy. A single ledger lay open, filled with neat, spidery script. Behind the desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, crammed with leather-bound volumes, their spines faded and cracked with age. Unlike the rest of the house, there was little dust here. The room felt preserved, hermetically sealed. Yet, despite the apparent order, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was stale, heavy, carrying the scent of aging paper and binding glue, but also that strange, sharp ozone tang, stronger here than in the hall. There were no personal touches, no photographs, no decorations save for a single, disturbing object on the corner of the desk, a piece of gnarled, blackened wood twisted into a vaguely humanoid shape, resembling one of the figures scratched into the hallway walls. "The records," Matron Hemlock said, gesturing towards the bookshelves with a sweep of her hand, "as they are, maintained since St. Augustine's founding." Eleanor stepped inside, feeling the oppressive weight of the room settle on her. The silence here was different, not empty, but watchful, as if the books themselves held their breath, listening. "I'll need to see the admission files for the current residents, matron, medical histories, psychological assessments, if any exist, incident reports." Matron Hemlock moved behind the imposing desk, seating herself in a high-backed leather chair that seemed almost throne-like in the dim light filtering through the single, grimy window. She didn't immediately move to retrieve any files. Instead, she folded her hands on the open ledger, her slate-gray eyes fixing on Eleanor. "Our records are traditional," Miss Vance. We do not adhere to the exhaustive, often intrusive, paperwork demanded by modern bureaucracy. We document what is necessary for the care and understanding of our children. Necessary according to whom? Eleanor countered, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. State regulations require certain documentation for licensed facilities. St. Augustine's operates under a charter older than most of your state's regulations. The matron interrupted, her voice hardening slightly. We are grandfathered, you might say. Our patrons understood the unique nature of our work, the need for discretion. She finally rose, moving towards one section of the bookshelf filled with identical, unlabeled, dark green binders. She selected several, handling them with a strange reverence. Admission logs, basic medical notes kept by my predecessors and myself. Incident notations are integrated. She placed the binders on the edge of the desk, a clear boundary established between them. Eleanor stepped forward, reaching for the topmost binder. It felt cold to the touch. The cheap vinyl cover, strangely damp. She opened it. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, filled with the same neat, spidery handwriting she'd seen in the ledger. The entries were sparse, clinical, often archaic in their language. Subject number 7 admitted. Foundling. Approximate age 5. Nonverbal. Exhibits aversion to direct light. Assigned name, Silas. Subject number 11. Lila. Age approximates 6. Prone to fugue states. Claims affinity with non-visible spectra. Requires calming drafts. There were no surnames, only numbers and assigned first names. Birth dates were listed as unknown or estimated. Admission circumstances were vague. Abandoned parish steps, recovered from wilderness, parental relinquishment, unspecified circumstances. Medical notes were minimal, mentioning resistance to common treatments, unusual recuperative abilities, or strange allergic reactions. One entry noted a severe dermatological reaction to consecrated water. Psychological assessments were non-existent, replaced by observations about attunement, receptivity to frequencies, or shadow affinity. Incident reports were indeed integrated, noted in the margins with chilling brevity. Nocturnal disturbance, Dormitory B. Containment protocols initiated. Subject number 4 exhibited uncontrolled projection. Sedation administered. Lila conversed with wall bindings. Standard isolation period observed. It was unlike any case file Eleanor had ever seen. It was less a record of child welfare and more like lab notes. Scientific, detached, chillingly impersonal, and old. Some entries clearly dated back decades, suggesting some of these children might be far older than they appeared. This is insufficient, matron, Eleanor said, struggling to maintain her composure. There are no family histories, no proper medical evaluations, no details on their lives before arriving here. Their lives began when they arrived at St. Augustine's, Matron Hemlock stated flatly. The past is irrelevant, often contaminated. We provide sanctuary, a place where their true natures can be understood, managed. True natures. Eleanor looked up from the disturbing pages, meeting the matron's unwavering gaze. What are you implying? Who are these children? The matron leaned forward slightly, her eyes seeming to absorb the dim light. They are the vessels, Miss Vance. The listeners. Children born sensitive to the frequencies others ignore. They hear the earth breathe, the stones remember. They see the patterns beneath the surface of your reality. Here, we teach them control. We protect them, and we protect the world from them, should control falter. The hair on the back of Eleanor's neck prickled. This wasn't just eccentricity. It bordered on delusional, cult-like rhetoric. Yet, the memory of those empty eyes, the unnatural synchronicity, the cold radiating from the walls, doubt gnawed at her certainty. Could there be something more here than simple neglect or abuse masked by bizarre beliefs? She turned a page in the binder. A loose sheet of paper, newer than the others, was tucked inside. It wasn't a formal record, but a hand-drawn sketch. It depicted a complex, web-like diagram centered around the twisted, humanoid shape Eleanor had seen carved from wood on the desk. Lines connected this central figure to smaller, stick-like figures, each labeled with a number corresponding to the children's designations. Spirals and jagged symbols, like those in the hall, were scattered throughout the diagram. Beneath it, written in the same spidery script, were the words, Nexus Alignment Strengthening, Phase Imminent, Containment Integrity Paramount. Before Eleanor could fully process the disturbing implications, Matron Hemlock reached across the desk, her movements swift and sudden, snatching the paper away. Her face, usually impassive, held a flicker of something else? Anger? Fear? Internal notes, she snapped, her voice sharp. Not relevant to your assessment. She crumpled the paper in her fist, her knuckles white. Eleanor stood her ground. What phase is imminent, matron? What containment? What nexus alignment? The matron's eyes narrowed. You ask too many questions, Miss Vance. You probe where you're not welcome. Your concern should be limited to creature comforts, adequate food, bedding, warmth. Matters of the spirit, of their essential nature, are beyond your purview. And perhaps, she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper, beyond your comprehension. A floorboard creaked loudly just outside the study door. Both women froze. Eleanor glanced towards the door, her heart pounding. Was someone listening? The silence pressed back in, thick and absolute. After a moment, Matron Hemlock seemed to regain her composure, though the tension remained palpable. I need to see the rest of the facility, Eleanor insisted, deciding to change tactics to gather more visual evidence. The dormitories, the classrooms, the grounds. Matron Hemlock hesitated, her gaze calculating. The crumpled paper remained clenched in her hand. Very well, she conceded finally, her voice tight. A brief tour, but quickly. We must not disturb their quiet period further. She rose, smoothing her dress, the picture of stern control once more, though Eleanor could see the faint tremor in her hand as she tucked the crumpled sketch into her pocket. Follow me, and try, she added, pausing at the door, her eyes locking with Eleanor's, not to disturb the shadows. She opened the study door and stepped back into the dim, cold corridor. Eleanor followed. The cryptic diagram burned into her mind, the words containment integrity paramount echoing ominously. The house felt different now, not just old and neglected, but actively guarding something monstrous, something stirring in the darkness, waiting for a phase to become imminent. Her assessment had taken a terrifying turn, moving from potential neglect to something far stranger, far more dangerous. She glanced down the hallway, wondering again about the skittering sound, the creaking floorboard. Were they truly alone? Or were the children, the listeners, already aware of the secrets she was beginning to uncover? Chapter 2. Moonlit Games and Silent Screams. Matron Hemlock led Eleanor away from the study, back towards the central intersection and then down a different corridor, one that seemed even colder and damper than the others. Water stains bloomed more aggressively on the walls here, some trailing down from the ceiling in long, greenish streaks like weeping wounds. The floorboards groaned underfoot with every step, protesting the intrusion. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and wet stone, overlaid with the faint, persistent scent of disinfectant that failed to mask the underlying decay. There were no windows in this section, only pools of deeper shadow between widely spaced, bare bulbs that flickered intermittently, threatening to plunge the passage into complete darkness. The dormitories are on the upper floors, the matron stated, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Separated by age group, nominally, though their development doesn't always follow conventional timelines. She gestured towards a narrow, steep staircase at the end of the hall, its wooden treads worn smooth and concave in the center from generations of use. Girls' wing is to the left on the second floor, boys to the right. The third floor houses the isolation rooms and storage. Isolation rooms. The phrase sent a chill through Eleanor. Recalling the casual notation in Lila's file, standard isolation period observed. What constituted a standard period? And why? Are children frequently placed in isolation, matron? Eleanor asked, trying to keep her tone level. Only when necessary, Hemlock replied curtly, starting up the stairs. For their own protection, or the protection of others. When their sensitivities become overwhelming, it is a place for quiet contemplation, for regaining balance. Her description sont benigen. But the way the shadows seemed to deepen around the mention of the third floor suggested otherwise. The stairs creaked alarmingly under their weight. Eleanor placed her hand on the rough, splintery wooden banister for support, half expecting it to crumble beneath her touch. As they ascended, the sounds from the ground floor faded, replaced by a different kind of silence, one that felt thin, stretched taut, as if listening intently for any disturbance. Reaching the second-floor landing, Eleanor could see two corridors branching off, mirroring the layout below, though narrower and lower-ceilinged. The air up here felt different, too, still cold but somehow charged, buzzing with a low-level energy that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. It was similar to the ozone tang in the study, but more diffuse, less concentrated. Girl's wing, Matron Hemlock announced, turning left. This corridor was marginally brighter, with a few grimy windows overlooking the bleak, weed-choked gardens at the back of the orphanage. Doors lined both sides, painted appealing, institutional cream color. Small, tarnished brass numbers were affixed to each one. There were no names, no decorations, nothing to personalize the spaces beyond. The matron stopped before one door, number 204, and pushed it open without knocking. A typical dormitory. Eleanor peered inside. The room was small, Spartan, containing 4 narrow, iron-framed beds, each made up with thin, gray blankets pulled taut over flat mattresses. The precision was military, unnatural for children's beds. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, currently unlit. The only furniture besides the beds were 4 small wooden lockers against the far wall. The room was immaculately clean, almost sterile, yet it felt profoundly cheerless, devoid of any warmth or personality. A single window, identical to the ones in the corridor, looked out onto the same bleak view. There were no toys, no books, no pictures, nothing to indicate that children actually lived here. Where are their personal belongings? Eleanor asked, stepping inside. The chill in the room seemed to emanate directly from the bare plaster walls. Possessions encourage attachment to the material world, Matron Hemlock stated from the doorway, her presence seeming to block out the dim light from the hall. We encourage focus on the internal landscape. Necessary items are stored. Eleanor walked towards the window, noticing faint scratches on the sill, similar in style to the ones downstairs, jagged lines, empty eye sockets. Looking down, she could see the skeletal swing set, motionless in the damp air. Beyond it, the woods pressed close, a dark, impenetrable wall of ancient trees. The forest seemed to possess a brooding presence, watching the orphanage with unseen eyes. As she watched, she thought she saw a flicker of movement deep within the tree-line, something pale gliding between the dark trunks, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving her questioning her own senses. The proximity to the woods, is it safe for the children? Eleanor asked, turning back to the matron. The woods are part of their education, Hemlock replied enigmatically. They understand the boundaries. They know what resides there, and what watches from within. A faint smile touched her lips again. Nature has its own lessons, often more potent than scripture. Eleanor felt a cold dread seep into her. What resided in the woods? She looked back at the empty beds, the sterile room. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage, designed to contain something the matron clearly feared, or perhaps revered. She checked another room, 206, finding it identical, cold, bare, unnervingly tidy. She saw more scratches near the window. Deeper this time, some drawing faint, dark lines as if whatever had made them had drawn blood. They crossed the landing to the boy's wing. It was a mirror image of the girls, equally cold, equally silent. Matron Hemlock opened door 211. For more iron beds, gray blankets, bare walls. This must be where Silas slept. Eleanor scanned the room, looking for any sign of the boy's intense, withdrawn personality. There was nothing, save for one subtle detail. On the floor, tucked away in the corner beneath the window, lay a single, smooth, dark stone about the size of a robin's egg. It seemed out of place in the otherwise barren room. As Eleanor's gaze fell upon it, she felt a distinct pulse of cold energy, a brief, sharp throb against her senses, almost like a warning. She quickly looked away, unnerved. "Satisfied, Miss Vance?" Matron Hemlock asked, her tone impatient. "As you can see, conditions are basic, but clean and orderly. There is nothing here to concern the county." "Orderly, yes," Eleanor conceded, stepping back into the hall, "but also incredibly bleak. Children need stimulation, comfort, things to call their own." "Their comforts are not of your world," the matron countered, closing the door firmly. "Their stimulation comes from elsewhere." She started back towards the stairs. "We have seen the essentials. The rest of the facility, classrooms, the infirmary, the chapel, are much the same. Austere, functional. And the third floor?" Eleanor asked, determined not to be deterred. "The isolation rooms?" Matron Hemlock paused at the top of the main staircase, her hand resting on the newel post. She turned slowly, her face cast in shadow by the light from below. "The third floor is not part of the standard tour, Miss Vance. It is used infrequently and only under specific circumstances. Access is restricted. My assessment needs to be thorough," Eleanor insisted, meeting the matron's shadowy gaze. "If children are being confined, I need to see the conditions." For a tense moment, Eleanor thought the matron would refuse outright. Hemlock's jaw tightened, and her eyes seemed to glint in the darkness. The air around them crackled, almost audibly. Then, with a sigh that sounded like grating stone, she nodded stiffly. "Very well, but briefly and silently. Some areas are sensitive to disruption." She bypassed the main staircase leading down and instead moved towards the narrower, steeper flight of stairs Eleanor had noticed earlier, the one presumably leading to the third floor. These stairs were uncarpeted, the wood dark and treacherous-looking. As they ascended, the air grew noticeably colder, the dampness more pronounced. The silence here was different yet again, heavy, profound, as if sound itself was afraid to trespass. There were no windows on this landing, only a single, flickering bulb overhead that cast long, dancing shadows. The corridor stretching before them was narrow and pitch dark beyond the immediate reach of the bulb. "Use is infrequent," Matron Hemlock whispered, her voice barely disturbing the oppressive silence. She didn't proceed down the corridor, but stopped beside the first door on the left. It was heavier than the dormitory doors, reinforced with iron bands, and featured a small, sliding peephole at eye level. There was no number, no identification. "This is one of the quiet rooms." She slid open the peephole cover with a soft, grating sound. Eleanor leaned forward, peering into the almost complete darkness within. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. She could make out the shape of a small, windowless room, completely bare. No bed, no furniture, nothing. The walls seemed padded, though it was hard to tell in the gloom. But what drew her attention were the markings covering every visible surface of the padding. Frantic, overlapping scratches, gouges, and symbols, far denser and more chaotic than the ones downstairs. It looked like the inside of a cage where something had desperately, violently tried to claw its way out. The air drifting through the peephole was freezing cold and carried a faint, lingering scent of fear, acrid and sharp. Eleanor recoiled instinctively, a wave of nausea washing over her. "How long are children kept in here?" she whispered, horrified. "As long as necessary for the storm to pass," Matron Hemlock replied calmly, sliding the peephole shut. "It is for their own good, to prevent them from harming themselves or others." Before Eleanor could press further, a sound drifted from the far end of the pitch-dark corridor. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart, a soft, rhythmic chanting, accompanied by a shuffling, scraping noise. It wasn't the monotonous humming from the refectory. This was different. Faster, laced with something that sounded like glee. "What is that?" Eleanor whispered, straining to hear. Matron Hemlock went rigid, her head cocked, listening intently. The strange, buzzing energy Eleanor had felt in the second floor was much stronger here, making her teeth vibrate slightly. "They should be in quiet, period," the matron muttered, a frown creasing her brow. The chanting grew slightly louder, resolving into distinct words, though in a language Eleanor didn't recognize, guttural. Clicking sounds interspersed with sibilant whispers. The shuffling intensified. "Stay here," Matron Hemlock commanded, her voice low and urgent. She started down the dark corridor, moving with surprising speed and silence, disappearing into the blackness beyond the flickering bulb's reach. Eleanor hesitated for only a second. Her instructions were clear, but her instincts screamed louder. Something was happening down that corridor, something connected to the secrets of this place, and she couldn't stay behind. Taking a deep breath, ignoring the cold dread coiling in her stomach, she crept forward, following the matron into the oppressive darkness, guided only by the increasingly loud and disturbing sounds echoing from the end of the hall. The flickering bulb behind her cast her shadow long and distorted before her, a silent companion swallowed by the encroaching gloom. She was deliberately disobeying the matron, stepping further into the forbidden zones of St. Augustine's, drawn towards the heart of its shadowed mystery. The darkness at the end of the third-floor corridor was absolute, swallowing the meager light from the flickering bulb completely. Eleanor moved cautiously, one hand trailing along the cold, damp plaster of the wall for guidance. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the smell of dust, decay, and something else, a sharp, metallic scent that reminded her disturbingly of blood, much stronger here than anywhere else in the house. The chanting grew louder, clearer, though the language remained alien and unsettling, a rapid-fire cadence of clicks, guttural stops, and whispering sibilants that seemed to slither through the air. The shuffling sound resolved into the distinct noise of something being dragged across the wooden floorboards. She could just make out Matron Hemlock's silhouette ahead, paused near what seemed to be an open doorway at the very end of the hall. Pale, flickering light spilled out from the room beyond, casting eerie, dancing shadows back down the corridor. The chanting and dragging sounds emanated from within that room. Hemlock stood rigidly, watching, making no move to intervene immediately. Eleanor crept closer, staying tight against the wall, peering around the matron's austere figure. The room beyond was large, appearing to be some sort of disused attic space, cluttered with indistinct shapes draped in dusty white sheets, forgotten furniture, discarded remnants of the orphanage's long history. But the center of the room was clear, illuminated by a strange, fluctuating light source that Eleanor couldn't immediately identify. It wasn't electric light. It pulsed with a sickly, greenish-white luminescence, casting sharp, unnatural shadows. In the center of this pool of eerie light, several of the children were gathered. Eleanor recognized Silas immediately, his dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, his eyes wide and unervingly bright, fixed on something in the middle of their circle. Lila was there too, her small face intense, her lips moving silently, seemingly in counterpoint to the louder chanting of the others. Two older boys Eleanor hadn't seen clearly before completed the group. They were the ones chanting aloud, their voices raw, their bodies swaying rhythmically. And in the center of their circle lay the source of the shuffling sound, another child, a boy, pale and thin, lying limp and unresponsive on the dusty floorboards. He looked younger than Lila, perhaps only 5 or 6. His eyes were closed, his face slack. The older boys were slowly dragging him by the ankles, rotating his still form counterclockwise within the chanting circle. Around the boy's body, intricate patterns had been drawn on the floor in what looked disturbingly like chalk or possibly salt. The patterns resembled the complex web Eleanor had seen sketched in the study, radiating outwards from the unconscious child. But it was the light source that truly horrified her. Hovering a few feet above the center of the circle, pulsating gently, was a vaguely spherical object about the size of a human head. It seemed composed of swirling, semi-translucent mist, emitting the cold, greenish-white glow. Within the mist, indistinct shapes shifted and writhed, hints of faces contorted in silent screams, skeletal limbs, grasping claws, forming and dissolving in a nauseating display. It was indescribably alien and radiated a palpable aura of malice and cold that Eleanor could feel even from the doorway. Prickling her skin like freezer burn, the chanting reached a crescendo. Silas suddenly dropped to his knees beside the unconscious boy. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the younger child's chest. His eyes rolled back in his head, showing only the whites, and the low humming Eleanor remembered from the refectory began again. Deep in his chest, but this time it was distorted, powerful, resonating with the pulsating light above. Lila, meanwhile, began to trace patterns in the air with her fingers, her movements mirroring the chalk-like symbols on the floor, her eyes fixed on the swirling, ghostly light. Eleanor felt frozen, trapped between horrified fascination and the urgent need to intervene. This wasn't a game. This was some kind of ritual, bizarre and terrifying, performed under the influence of something unnatural. What were they doing to that poor child? Before Eleanor could react, Matron Hemlock moved, not with anger or alarm, but with a swift, practiced efficiency. She stepped into the room, her voice cutting through the chanting, sharp and commanding, though still strangely calm. Enough. The cycle is incomplete. You risk imbalance. The effect was instantaneous. The chanting stopped abruptly. The older boys froze, their eyes wide, snapping back to a semblance of awareness. Silas collapsed forward, gasping, his eyes rolling back down, though they remained unfocused. Lila dropped her hands, blinking rapidly as if waking from a trance. The eerie, pulsating light flickered violently, the shapes within swirling faster, and then, with a soft implosion that seemed to suck the air from the room, it vanished, plunging the attic into near darkness, relieved only by the faint light filtering in from the corridor. The profound coldness emanating from the light's source dissipated instantly, leaving behind only the damp chill of the attic. The younger boy on the floor remained still, unresponsive. "To your dormitories." "Now," Matron Hemlock ordered, her voice leaving no room for argument. The older boys scrambled to their feet, avoiding her gaze, and scurried past Eleanor out into the corridor, their earlier intensity replaced by a sullen fear. Silas pushed himself up slowly, swaying slightly, his eyes still glazed. Lila looked from the unconscious boy to the matron, her small face pale and pinched. "But the offering," Lila whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "The shadows, they were hungry." The offering was premature, Hemlock snapped, turning her attention to the small boy on the floor. She knelt beside him, her movements surprisingly gentle as she checked his pulse, listened to his breathing. "He is stable." The resonance was not fully established. "Get Silas downstairs. See that he rests." Lila hesitated, glancing fearfully towards the spot where the light had hovered, then nodded numbly. She took Silas's arm, and the older boy leaned on her heavily as she guided him slowly out of the attic and down the dark corridor, their footsteps echoing unevenly. Eleanor finally found her voice, stepping fully into the room, her legs trembling. "Matron, what in God's name was that? What were they doing to him? What was that light?" Matron Hemlock looked up from the unconscious child, her face unreadable in the dimness. "A game, Miss Vance. Overzealous, perhaps. Children explore boundaries, especially these children. A game," Eleanor repeated incredulously, gesturing around the ritualistic scene. "With chanting and symbols and that thing? He's unconscious." And Lila mentioned an offering. "Lila has an active imagination," the matron said dismissively, though her eyes didn't quite meet Eleanor's. She carefully scooped the small boy up into her arms. He was alarmingly light. He merely fainted. The excitement was too much for him. His constitution is delicate. Eleanor didn't believe a word of it. The cold, the light, the chanting, the palpable sense of ancient malice. It was no game. It was something far darker, something the matron was actively trying to conceal. I need to report this, matron. This is beyond neglect. This is dangerous. Matron Hemlock rose, holding the small child protectively. Her shadow stretched long and menacing in the dim light from the corridor. "Report what, Miss Vance?" she asked softly, her voice dangerously smooth. "That you trespassed in a restricted area? That you witnessed children engaging in imaginative play you didn't understand? That you misinterpreted their unique ways of coping with their condition?" She took a step towards Eleanor. "Who do you think the county will believe? Me, who has dedicated decades to these troubled souls? Or an outsider, a newcomer, prone to hysterics after a few hours in an old house?" The implication was clear. Her word against the matron's. And the matron held all the cards, the history, the isolation, the bizarre, but potentially plausible explanation of unique sensitivities. Eleanor felt a surge of frustration and fear. She had stumbled onto something terrible, but proving it seemed impossible. "I know what I saw," Eleanor whispered, standing her ground despite the tremor in her voice. "Do you?" Matron Hemlock's eyes glinted. "Or did you merely see what the shadows wanted you to see? Perception is a fragile thing in this place." She brushed past Eleanor, carrying the small boy out of the attic. "Your assessment is concluded for the day, Miss Vance. It is getting late. The roads back are treacherous after dark." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. Eleanor watched her disappear down the corridor, the small boy limp in her arms. Left alone in the dusty, chilling attic, the faint metallic smell seeming to cling to her, Eleanor stared at the chalk-like patterns on the floor, the empty space where the terrifying light had pulsed. The silence was absolute now, but it felt pregnant, watchful. She could almost feel the residue of that cold, malevolent energy. She knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. Reporting this now, without more concrete evidence, would likely achieve nothing except getting herself removed from the case, leaving the children trapped here with whatever darkness the matron presided over. She needed proof. She needed to understand what was really happening to the children of the shadows. But as she turned to leave the attic, a faint whisper seemed to echo from the darkest corner of the room. A sibilant breath, just at the edge of hearing. "Hungry." Eleanor fled the attic, her heart pounding, the whisper seeming to chase her down the dark corridor. The moon, obscured by clouds earlier, must have emerged, because thin beams of silvery light now slanted through the grimy windows on the second-floor landing as she descended the stairs, painting eerie patterns on the floor. The house seemed different in the moonlight, sharper, colder, the shadows deeper and more menacing. She had seen a glimpse behind the veil, and the reality was far more terrifying than she could have imagined. Her assessment had become a rescue mission, but she was beginning to fear she was just as trapped as the children themselves. Eleanor practically stumbled down the last flight of stairs, her breath catching in ragged gasps, the chilling whisper from the attic seeming to echo in the cavernous space of the entrance hall. The heavy front door loomed like a sealed tomb entrance. Matron Hemlock was nowhere to be seen, likely having taken the small, unconscious boy to the infirmary, or perhaps somewhere less conventional. Eleanor leaned against the cold wood paneling, trying to quell the frantic pounding of her heart, forcing herself to think rationally despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Leaving now was impossible. Reporting this without proof was futile, potentially dangerous for the children if the authorities simply dismissed her claims and alerted Hemlock. She was trapped, not just physically within these oppressive walls, but ethically. She couldn't abandon these children to whatever arcane horrors unfolded under the guise of care. She needed a plan. She needed evidence. And she needed to avoid the matron. Glancing around the shadowy hall, she spotted a door slightly ajar beneath the main staircase, a space often used for storage or sometimes, in older institutions, containing a small, rarely used receiving room or cloakroom. Slipping inside, she found herself in a cramped, musty space filled with cleaning supplies, stacked linen smelling faintly of lye, and discarded rubber boots. It wasn't comfortable, but it was concealed. She eased the door almost shut, leaving only a crack to peer through, and sank down onto an overturned wooden bucket, the rough wood biting into her legs through her trousers. The silence of the house pressed in, broken only by the groan of settling timbers and the distant, mournful sigh of the wind outside. Hours seemed to crawl by. Dusk bled into true night, the weak gray light fading entirely from the high windows, replaced by the cold, ethereal glow of the moon finding its way through gaps in the heavy cloud cover. The quality of the silence changed as darkness deepened. It became heavier, more watchful, punctuated by faint, unidentifiable sounds, a soft scraping from upstairs, a distant tapping that might have been Silas or something else entirely. A low hum that seemed to vibrate through the very structure of the building, felt more than heard. It was the house settling into its nocturnal rhythm, a rhythm Eleanor now knew involved far more than sleep. Her makeshift hiding place grew colder, the damp chill seeping into her bones. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and her muscles ached from tension. Sometime deep into the night, when the ancient grandfather clock in the hall remained stubbornly silent, but the moon rode high and bright, casting stark, skeletal shadows through the entrance hall windows, Eleanor knew she couldn't wait any longer. The matron would likely be asleep, or at least confined to her own quarters. The children, well, the children were another matter entirely, but if she was going to find anything, now was the time. Pushing herself stiffly to her feet, Eleanor eased the cloakroom door open and slipped out into the moon-drenched hallway. The familiar space looked alien and deeply menacing under the silvery light. Shadows pooled like ink in the corners and under furniture, seeming to writhe with hidden movement. Every creak of the floorboards under her cautious steps sounded amplified, echoing in the vast stillness. She felt exposed, vulnerable, acutely aware that despite the silence, she was likely not alone. The house itself felt awake, aware. Her goal was twofold: attempt to access the study again, hoping the matron hadn't locked it securely after their confrontation, and observe the dormitories, trying to understand the children's nocturnal state. She decided on the dormitories first, reasoning they were closer and potentially held clues about the children's immediate condition after the aborted ritual, moving with painstaking slowness. Avoiding the patches of bright moonlight where she might be easily seen from an upper window or doorway, she reached the bottom of the main staircase. The ascent was nerve-wracking. Each tread seemed to groan louder than the last. Reaching the second-floor landing, she paused, listening intently. The low, ambient humming was more noticeable here, a faint, multi-layered thrum that seemed to emanate from behind the closed dormitory doors. It wasn't loud, but it was pervasive, unsettling. Moonlight streamed through the landing window, illuminating the corridor leading towards the girls' wing. She crept down the corridor, pausing outside room 204, the one she'd seen earlier. Pressing her ear carefully against the cold wood, she could hear faint, rhythmic breathing, multiple sources, seemingly normal sleep. But beneath it, the low humming persisted, seemingly independent of the sleepers. And there was something else, a faint, repetitive whispering, too low to make out the words, but undeniably present. Moving on to 206, she heard the same, rhythmic breathing overlaid with the constant hum and indistinct whispers. It was as if the children slept, but some other part of them, or something connected to them, remained active, communicating in the dark. Heart pounding, she crossed the landing to the boys' wing. The humming felt subtly stronger here, the air colder. Outside door 211, Silas's room, the sounds were different. There was the hum, yes, deeper and more resonant than in the girls' rooms, but no sound of regular breathing. Instead, she heard soft, deliberate movements, the rustle of fabric and a low, monotonous chanting. Different from the ritualistic chant in the attic, this was slower, more introspective, using some of the same guttural clicks, but woven into a different pattern. Was he awake? Or was this some kind of sleepwalking, sleep-chanting state? Gathering her courage, Eleanor knelt down, trying to peer through the old-fashioned keyhole. The angle was awkward, the view restricted, but she could make out movement within the moonlit room. Silas was not in bed. He was kneeling on the floor near the window, the smooth, dark stone she had noticed earlier held loosely in his hand. His head was bowed, his body swaying slightly in time with his low chant. Moonlight illuminated his pale face, his eyes closed, his expression rapt, focused inward. He seemed utterly absorbed in his private ritual. Suddenly, he lifted his head, his chanting momentarily faltering. His eyes snapped open, staring directly towards the door, directly towards the keyhole where Eleanor was peering. They weren't the glazed, unfocused eyes she'd seen after the attic ritual. These were sharp, intelligent, and filled with an unnerving awareness. They seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, reflecting the cold light like a predator's. Eleanor froze, barely daring to breathe, convinced he had somehow sensed her presence. Had he heard her, seen the subtle shift of light through the keyhole? Or was his perception, as the matron hinted, simply different? For a long, terrifying moment, he held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, a faint, chilling smile touched his lips. It wasn't friendly. It was knowing, almost mocking. He raised the dark stone slightly, tilting it so the moonlight caught its surface, revealing intricate, almost invisible carvings that seemed to shift and writhe in the light. Then, just as deliberately, he closed his eyes again, bowed his head, and resumed his low, monotonous chant, dismissing her as completely as if she hadn't been there at all. Eleanor scrambled back from the door, her breath catching in her throat. He knew she was watching, and he wasn't afraid. The encounter left her profoundly shaken. The children weren't just passive victims or vessels. At least Silas possessed an awareness, a chilling self-possession that hinted at a deeper, more complex, and far more dangerous reality. Retreating from the boy's wing, heart hammering against her ribs, Eleanor decided against trying to study tonight. Her nerves were shot, and the risk of encountering the matron, or worse, more aware children, seemed too great. She needed to process what she'd seen, what she'd felt from Silas. But as she turned to creep back towards the main staircase, her foot brushed against something small and soft lying on the floorboards near the entrance to the boys' corridor, almost hidden in the shadow. She stooped to pick it up. It was a small, crudely made doll, fashioned from gray felt scraps stitched together with thick black thread. It had button eyes, mismatched and unsettling, and hair made from what looked disturbingly like strands of real, lank brown hair. A simple gray dress, mirroring the children's uniforms, clothed the figure. Pinned to the doll's chest with a rusty safety pin was a small, folded piece of brittle paper. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she carefully unpinned and unfolded it in a patch of moonlight. Drawn in charcoal, with the same frantic energy as the scratches on the walls, was a figure. It depicted a woman with features vaguely resembling Eleanor's own. Her shorter hair, her blazer, but the figure was contorted, trapped within a complex web of jagged lines and spirals, identical to those on the attic floor and the sketch the matron had snatched away. The figure's eyes were wide, screaming, though no mouth was drawn. Below the trapped figure, a single word was scrawled in childish, blocky letters. Soon, a wave of icy fear washed over Eleanor, colder than the chill of the house. This wasn't just a random find. This was a message, a warning, left for her. By whom? Lila, perhaps? Or was it a threat from Silas? A demonstration of his knowing smirk? Soon? Soon for what? Containment? The imminent phase the matron's note mentioned? Was the drawing depicting her fate? Clutching the disturbing doll and its terrifying message, Eleanor fled back towards the relative safety of the cloakroom beneath the stairs, the single word soon echoing in her mind. Mixing with the memory of Silas's knowing eyes and the faint, pervasive hum that seemed to promise horrors yet to come. The moonlit games were over for tonight, but the silent screams depicted in the drawing felt terrifyingly real, a premonition of what awaited anyone who pried too deeply into the secrets of St. Augustine's. The unmaking room mentioned in the next chapter title suddenly felt less like a place and more like a destination. Chapter 3. The Unmaking Room. The hours following the discovery of the crude doll were a torment of sleepless anxiety. Eleanor remained huddled in the cramped, musty cloakroom, the disturbing felt figure clutched in her hand. The single word soon burned into her consciousness. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind against the windows, every fluctuation in the low, pervasive humming from the upper floors seemed amplified, feeding her growing dread. Silas's knowing, moonlit smile haunted her thoughts. Was he merely an unusually perceptive, disturbed child, or something more intrinsically connected to the darkness that permeated St. Augustine's? And the doll, a child's plea for help? A malicious warning? The ambiguity was almost worse than overt hostility. Dawn arrived not with warmth or hope, but as a gradual dilution of the oppressive darkness, the gray, weak light filtering reluctantly through the grime-caked windows. The sound from upstairs shifted subtly. The humming lessened slightly, punctuated now by faint stirrings, the soft thud of feet hitting bare floors, the distant murmur of voices, though still hushed, subdued, lacking the boisterous energy of a typical morning. Eleanor knew she couldn't stay hidden much longer. Matron Hemlock would expect her to either have left yesterday evening or to make her presence known soon. Prolonged absence would only heighten suspicion. Stiffly, she pushed herself to her feet, muscles aching from the cold and the cramped position. She smoothed her clothes as best she could, tucked the felt doll deep in her blazer pocket, a disturbing secret kept close, and took a steadying breath. She needed to project normalcy, professionalism, despite the terror churning within her. Her objective remained the same: find concrete evidence, understand the nature of the threat, and find a way to help the children, if help was even possible. The matron's study, with its cryptic records and the memory of that snatched sketch, felt like the most logical place to start, despite the risks. Emerging cautiously from the cloakroom, Eleanor found the entrance hall bathed in the same gloomy morning light as yesterday. The silence felt brittle, expectant. She made her way towards the corridor leading to the study, her footsteps echoing unervingly. She half expected Matron Hemlock to appear suddenly from a doorway, her slate eyes narrowed in suspicion, but the halls remained empty. The acrid, ozone tang was still noticeable as she approached the study door. To her surprise, it was slightly ajar. Had the matron forgotten to lock it after their confrontation, or had someone else been here? Pushing the door open silently, Eleanor peered inside. The room was as she remembered it, meticulously tidy, dominated by the massive desk and the oppressive bookshelves. The gnarled wooden effigy sat on the desk corner, seeming to watch her with unseen eyes. The ledger lay closed. Sunlight, weak though it was, streamed through the single window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. But something was different. A faint smell hung in the air, overriding the usual sense of old paper and ozone. The smell of burnt wood and something else. Something sickly sweet and chemical. Scanning the room, her eyes fell on the hearth of a small, unused fireplace set into one wall. Inside the grate was a small pile of fine gray ash, clearly fresh. Someone had recently burned documents here. Had the matron destroyed the sketch Eleanor had seen, or other incriminating records? Kneeling before the hearth, Eleanor gently sifted through the ashes with her fingertips. Mostly fine powder, but she found a few larger, charred fragments. Carefully she lifted one. Part of a complex diagram was still visible, intersecting lines, a partial spiral, before it crumbled to dust in her fingers. Another fragment held scorched, spidery handwriting. Failed resonance, vessel unprepared, adjust calibration. Failed resonance. Vessel unprepared. It confirmed her fears about the ritual in the attic. They had been attempting something specific with that unconscious boy, and it hadn't worked. But what calibration needed adjusting? And what, or who was the vessel? Before she could search further, a floorboard creaked just outside the study door. Eleanor froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She quickly stood up, brushing the ash from her fingers, trying to appear casual, though her pulse hammered against her ribs. The door swung open fully, revealing not Matron Hemlock, but Lila. The small girl stood framed in the doorway, her wispy brown hair catching the light from the hall, her large, dark eyes fixed on Eleanor. She held no doll today, her hands clasped loosely behind her back. Her expression was unreadable, not vacant like yesterday, but watchful, unnervingly solemn for a child her age. The ambient humming seemed slightly stronger around her, a low thrum emanating from her small frame. "He knows you were watching," Lila said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying clearly in the quiet room. Eleanor felt a chill despite the lack of accusation in the girl's tone. "Silas." Lila nodded, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. "He sees things in the spaces between. He saw you at his door. He saw you find the gift. The gift. The doll." So it was from Lila. A warning, then. "Why, Lila? Why warn me?" Eleanor asked, keeping her voice low and calm. Lila tilted her head, considering the question. "The pattern isn't right," she whispered, glancing towards the bookshelves lining the walls. "The lines are crooked. The matron, she pulls them too tight. The offering wasn't ready. The shadows, they don't like mistakes." She shivered slightly, despite the cold room. "It makes the walls thin." "Thin walls?" The phrase resonated with Matron Hemlock's talk of sensitivities and frequencies. "What happens when the walls get thin, Lila?" Lila's eyes widened slightly, reflecting a fear that seemed ancient. "Things slip through," she breathed. "From the before. From the deep woods. Things that hunger." She took a hesitant step into the room, lowering her voice further. "The unmaking room." It hums louder now, since the failed offering. "The unmaking room." Eleanor seized on the name, recalling it with a fresh wave of dread. "What is that, Lila? Where is it?" Lila's gaze flickered towards the fireplace, towards the fresh ashes. "Where bad things go," she whispered. "Where the pattern is undone. Where the wrong notes are silenced." Her eyes darted nervously towards the corridor, then back to Eleanor. "It's below, under the oldest stones, where the roots drink. Below, under the oldest stones. A basement? A cellar? Can you show me?" Eleanor asked urgently, sensing a crucial piece of the puzzle within reach. Lila hesitated, chewing on her lower lip. Fear warred with something else in her eyes. A desperate hope? A need to confide? "The matron keeps it locked. Always. Says the air is bad. But the hum, it calls." She looked directly at Eleanor, her small hand reaching out, almost touching Eleanor's arm before pulling back. Maybe you can fix the pattern? Before the soon happens." Before Eleanor could respond, the sharp, commanding voice of Matron Hemlock echoed from down the corridor. "Lila, what are you doing away from morning lessons?" "Miss Vance." Lila flinched violently, spinning around, her brief connection with Eleanor shattering. "Coming, Matron," she called back, her voice suddenly reverting to a child's obedient tone. She cast one last, wide-eyed, desperate look at Eleanor before scurrying out of the study and down the hall. Matron Hemlock appeared in the doorway moments later, her eyes narrowed, sweeping the room, lingering for a moment on the fireplace before settling on Eleanor. "Miss Vance, I had assumed you departed yesterday evening." Her voice was tight with suspicion. "My car wouldn't start." Eleanor lied quickly, hoping the excuse sounded plausible. "The damp, I suppose. I didn't want to disturb you late last night." The matron's expression didn't change. Indeed, a common affliction with vehicles left too long in our unique climate. She didn't sound convinced. "Were you looking for something?" Her gaze flickered again towards a fireplace. "Just retrieving my briefcase," Eleanor said, gesturing towards where she had left it near the door upon first entering the study yesterday. "I was hoping perhaps you had telephone access? My cell service is non-existent here. We have a line, yes. For emergencies," the matron conceded coolly. "Strictly monitored. Perhaps after you have concluded your assessment, we can arrange for assistance with your vehicle." The implication was clear. Finish your business and leave. However, she continued, stepping fully into the room, effectively blocking the doorway. "Since you're still here, there is another area I neglected to show you yesterday. Part of the original structure. The root cellar. Used primarily for storage now, of course. It might be pertinent to your assessment of our facilities." Eleanor's heart gave a jolt. The root cellar. Below, under the oldest stones. Was this it? Was the matron deliberately leading her to the unmaking room, perhaps to intimidate her, or worse? Or was this a genuine oversight, a coincidence? Given everything she had experienced, coincidence seemed unlikely. "Yes, of course," Eleanor replied, trying to keep her voice steady, masking the sudden surge of adrenaline and fear. "A thorough assessment includes all areas." "Excellent," Matron Hemlock said, a faint, unreadable smile touching her lips. It didn't reach her eyes, which remained cold and watchful. "Follow me. Mind your step. The stairs are quite old." She turned and led the way out of the study, heading not back towards the main hall, but deeper into the less traveled wing of the house, towards a part Eleanor hadn't yet explored. Lila's whispered warnings echoed in Eleanor's mind. Where bad things go, where the pattern is undone. She followed the matron, bracing herself, unsure if she was walking towards answers or into a trap. The unmaking room awaited. Matron Hemlock led Eleanor down a narrow, dusty service corridor Eleanor hadn't noticed before, tucked away behind the main staircase. This part of the orphanage felt even older, the stone walls rough and uneven, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something vaguely fungal. The sparse electrobulbs gave way entirely here, forcing them to rely on the weak daylight filtering through a single, grimy window high up near the ceiling at the corridor's end. Their footsteps echoed hollowly on the worn flagstone floor. At the very end of the passage, almost hidden in shadow, was a low, heavy wooden door bound with rusted iron straps. It looked ancient, significantly older than the other doors in the house. There was no handle, only a large iron ring pull. Matron Hemlock stopped before it, producing another large, archaic-looking key from the depths of her pocket. This one was even larger than the study key, intricately wrought and coated in rust. "The original entrance to the lower levels," Hemlock explained, her voice unnaturally loud in the confined space. "Before the main house was expanded. The foundations here are deep." She inserted the key into a massive, protesting lock. It took considerable effort, accompanied by loud, grating and screeching sounds, before the mechanism finally turned with a heavy clunk. Pulling on the iron ring, she opened the door inward, revealing a flight of steep, narrow stone steps plunging down into absolute darkness. A wave of intensely cold air billowed up from the opening, carrying a smell that made Eleanor recoil instinctively. It was a complex, nauseating odor, damp earth and mildew, yes, but also the sharp, coppery tang of old blood, the cloying sweetness of decay, and underlying it all, a strange, almost electrical scent, like the ozone in the study, but thicker, charged with a terrifying energy. It was the smell of violence, of fear left to fester for centuries. Lila's words flashed through her mind. "Where bad things go. Mind the steps," Matron Hemlock cautioned again, retrieving a large, old-fashioned oil lantern from hook just inside the doorway. She struck a match, the flare briefly illuminating her severe features, making her eyes seem like dark pits, before touching the flame to the lantern's wick. A greasy yellow light bloomed, casting flickering, distorted shadows. "The electricity is unreliable down here." She started down the steps, holding the lantern aloft. The light barely penetrated the oppressive darkness below, illuminating only a few steps at a time, each one slick with moisture and worn smooth in the center. Eleanor hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at her to turn back, to flee the house and never return. The cold emanating from the stairwell felt predatory, the smell viscid and choking. But the thought of the children, of Lila's desperate plea, of the soon scrawl beneath the trapped figure, propelled her forward. She took a deep breath, tasting the foul air, and began her descent into the bowels of St. Augustine's. The stone steps spiraled downward, deeper than Eleanor would have expected for a simple root cellar. The air grew colder, damper, the silence absolute save for their footsteps and the faint hiss of the lantern flame. The walls here were rough-hewn stone, glistening with moisture, and seemed to press inwards, amplifying the sense of claustrophobia. Strange, dark stains marred the stone in places, shapes that were horribly suggestive of old splatters and seepages. Eleanor tried not to look too closely. Finally, the stairs opened out into a vast, low-ceilinged space. The floor was packed earth, uneven and damp. Heavy stone pillars, part of the building's ancient foundations, marched at irregular intervals into the gloom beyond the lantern's reach, their surfaces slick with moisture and coated in pale, fungal growths. The air hung thick and still, vibrating with a low, almost subaudible hum. The same hum Eleanor had heard throughout the house, but here it was incredibly powerful, a physical pressure against her eardrums, resonating deep within her chest. It felt like standing inside the chest cavity of some vast, sleeping beast. "The root cellar," Matron Hemlock announced, sweeping the lantern in a slow arc. The light glinted off rows of dusty shelves lining one wall, sparsely populated with jars containing murky, preserved somethings. Other areas were filled with discarded furniture shrouded in dusty canvas, broken tools, and piles of unidentifiable debris. It looked like a typical, albeit creepy, cellar space, except for the overpowering hum and the bone-deep chill that seemed to radiate from the earth floor itself. As you can see, primarily storage, the matron continued, her voice sounding slightly strained, as if the hum affected her too. "We keep root vegetables here in the winter. The temperature is consistent." Eleanor scanned the space, her eyes trying to penetrate the shadows beyond the lantern's glow. Lila had said below, under the oldest stones. Was this all there was? It was deeply unpleasant, but didn't immediately scream, unmaking room. But then her gaze caught something at the far end of the cellar, partially obscured by a stack of rotting wooden crates. Another door, smaller than the entrance door, made of thick, dark wood, heavily reinforced with iron bands, just like the isolation room door on the third floor. It looked utterly out of place amidst the cellar clutter, and the low, resonant humming seemed to emanate directly from that door, pulsing like a dark heartbeat. "What's through there?" Eleanor asked, pointing, trying to keep her voice casual despite the sudden certainty gripping her. That was the place Lila meant. Matron Hemlock followed Eleanor's gesture, her face tightening almost imperceptibly in the lantern light. That is merely structural access to the older foundation work. Unsafe. It remains locked. Locked? Eleanor questioned, taking a step towards it. The humming intensified as she moved closer, the air growing colder, charged with that sharp, electrical tang. Why would structural access need a door like that? It looks like a vault. Ancient construction, Miss Vance, the matron snapped, moving to intercept her, holding the lantern defensively. Methods were different then. Concerns about subsidence? Perhaps. It has not been opened in generations. There is nothing of interest to your assessment beyond that door. Her insistence was too forceful, her explanation too thin. Eleanor stopped, facing the matron directly, the mysterious door only a dozen feet away now. The humming vibrated through the soles of her shoes. She could feel in her bones. Lila called it the unmaking room. She stated quietly, watching the matron's reaction closely. Matron Hemlock went utterly still. The slight tremor in her hand, holding the lantern, increased. Her eyes, reflecting the yellow light, narrowed into slits. For a moment, absolute silence descended, the omnipresent hum seeming to hold its breath. Then a slow, chilling smile spread across the matron's face, utterly devoid of warmth or humor. It was the smile of someone whose carefully constructed facade had finally, irrevocably cracked. "Clever Lila," Hemlock breathed, the sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. Always listening, always receptive. She lowered the lantern slightly, her gaze sweeping over Eleanor, cold and appraising. "So you know the name?" A childish name for a place of necessary correction. A place where dissonant notes are retuned to the proper harmony, where the pattern is reinforced. Correction? Eleanor felt ice trace its way down her spine. "What kind of correction happens in there, matron? What did you do to the children who didn't fit your pattern?" "Fit?" The matron chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "It is not about fitting, Miss Vance. It is about resonance. Alignment. Some vessels are flawed. They introduce static, distortions that threaten the integrity of the whole. They resist the harmony. Such resistance cannot be tolerated, especially now. Now when the convergence is so close." Convergence. Another cryptic term, like nexus alignment, like the imminent phase. "The unmaking room," Hemlock continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, simply helps them shed the static. It quiets the discordant notes. Permanently. The horrific implication hung in the cold, vibrating air. This wasn't just isolation or punishment. It was elimination. A place where children who didn't conform to the matron's twisted vision, who couldn't handle the frequencies or resonances, were unmade, silenced, permanently. Eleanor thought of the sparse records, the children deemed unplaceable, the lack of surnames or traceable histories. How many dissonant notes had been quieted in the crushing darkness beyond that iron-banded door? "You're a monster," Eleanor whispered, horrified, unconsciously taking a step back. "I'm a caretaker," Hemlock corrected, her smile tightening. "A protector of the balance. A necessary instrument in a process far older, far more important than your fleeting human morality." She raised the lantern higher, its light casting her shadow large and monstrous against the damp stone wall behind her. "And you, Miss Vance? With your questions, your probing, your disruption, you have become a profoundly dissonant note yourself, a static that threatens the calibration." The air crackled, the humming intensified, shaking the very foundations. Matron Hemlock took a deliberate step towards Eleanor, her eyes gleaming with fanatical light. "Perhaps," she said softly, dangerously, "it is time you experience the retuning process firsthand. Perhaps a visit to the unmaking room will help you harmonize." Before Eleanor could react, before she could turn and flee back up the treacherous stone steps, the matron lunged, faster than Eleanor would have thought possible, swinging the heavy oil lantern not as a light source, but as a weapon. The heavy oil lantern swung in a gleaming, terrifying arc through the dim cellar air. Eleanor reacted purely on instinct, years of ingrained self-preservation reflexes kicking in faster than conscious thought. She threw herself sideways, stumbling on the uneven earthen floor, the whoosh of the lantern passing inches from her head, its heat momentarily searing her cheek. She landed hard on her shoulder, the impact jarring through her body, the damp cold of the ground instantly soaking through her blazer. Matron Hemlock, thrown slightly off balance by the momentum of her swing, recovered quickly, her face contorted in a mask of righteous fury. The lantern, miraculously still lit, cast wild, dancing shadows as she raised it again, her eyes fixed on Eleanor with murderous intent. "Discordance must be silenced," she hissed, advancing again. Scrambling backwards on the damp earth, Eleanor frantically scanned the immediate area in the flickering lantern light. Discarded tools lay scattered near a pile of rotting sacks, a rusted shovel, a heavy length of chain, a pitchfork with missing tines. Her hand closed around the cold, rough wood of the shovel handle. It was heavy, unwieldy, but better than nothing. Pushing herself up into a crouch, She gripped the shovel like a club, its rusted metal edge facing the oncoming matron. "Stay back," Eleanor yelled, her voice trembling but firm, adrenaline momentarily overriding her fear. Hemlock paused, her eyes narrowing at the makeshift weapon. The chilling smile returned. "Resistance is futile, Miss Vance. The pattern demands harmony. Your static will be cleansed." She feinted to her left, then suddenly lunged forward again, swinging the lantern low this time, aiming for Eleanor's legs. Eleanor sidestepped, swinging the heavy shovel defensively. The rusted metal edge connected with the lantern's frame with a dull clang, sending the lantern skittering across the floor, its flames sputtering violently but not extinguishing. Hemlock staggered back, momentarily surprised by the force of the blow. For a terrifying second, they faced each other in the rapidly dimming, flickering light. The social worker armed with a rusty shovel, the fanatical matron poised like a predator. The intense, low humming from the unmaking room door seemed to pulse in time with Eleanor's frantic heartbeat, urging the violence onward. Seeing her chance while the matron was momentarily disoriented and the main light source was further away, Eleanor turned and scrambled towards the stairs leading back up, desperation lending speed to her movements. She slipped on the damp earth, falling to one knee, the shovel clattering away. "You cannot escape the convergence," Hemlock shrieked, recovering her balance and lunging after Eleanor, abandoning the lantern. Her hands, surprisingly strong, clawed at Eleanor's ankle, her fingernails digging painfully into the flesh. Eleanor kicked out instinctively, her heel connecting solidly with Hemlock's wrist. The matron cried out, her grip loosening just enough for Eleanor to wrench her leg free. She surged to her feet and threw herself at the stone steps, clawing her way up the first few stairs into the near-total darkness of the stairwell. Behind her, Hemlock let out a sound that was less human cry and more frustrated, guttural roar. Eleanor could hear her scrambling, fumbling for the fallen lantern in the gloom below. Panic fueled Eleanor's ascent up the spiraling stone steps. She climbed blindly, her hands scraping against the cold, slick stone walls, her lungs burning, the foul air seeming to choke her. The darkness was absolute, disorienting. She stumbled, catching herself on the rough wall, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Below, she heard the clink of metal as Hemlock presumably recovered the lantern, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps starting up the stairs after her. The faint light from the upper corridor seemed miles away, a tiny beacon of hope in the suffocating blackness. She pushed onward, driven by sheer terror. The matron's footsteps echoing relentlessly below, closer than Eleanor wanted to admit. Just as she reached the top step, gasping for breath, her hand reaching for the relative safety of the service corridor, a sharp pain exploded in her calf. Hemlock, with surprising agility, had reached up and grabbed her again, her grip like iron talons. Eleanor cried out, twisting, trying to pull free. Hemlock held fast, anchoring her at the top of the stairs, preventing her escape. The dissonant must be purged. Hemlock grunted, pulling harder, trying to drag Eleanor back down into the abyss. Desperate, Eleanor lashed out blindly with her free foot, kicking backwards down the stairs. Her foot connected with something solid, Hemlock's face or chest, eliciting a sharp grunt of pain and surprise. The grip on her ankle loosened momentarily. Eleanor yanked her leg free with a final surge of strength and scrambled forward into the service corridor, collapsing onto the flagstone floor, gasping for air, her entire body trembling. She looked back just as Matron Hemlock emerged from the stairwell, the regained lantern held high, illuminating her face. There was a smear of blood on the matron's lip, and her eyes burned with an incandescent fury. The mask of stern control was gone entirely, replaced by raw, zealous hatred. "There is nowhere to run," Hemlock snarled, taking a step into the corridor. "The house itself will hold you. The children will find you. You are part of the pattern now, whether you wish it or not." Knowing she couldn't outfight the surprisingly strong and utterly relentless matron, Eleanor pushed herself to her feet and ran. She fled down the narrow service corridor, away from the cellar entrance, heading towards the main part of the house, hoping to find somewhere, anywhere, to hide, to barricade herself. Her footsteps slapped frantically against the flagstones, echoing Hemlock's heavier, more deliberate pursuit behind her. She burst out of the service corridor near the main staircase, glancing wildly around the gloomy entrance hall. Where did she go? Upstairs? The dormitories felt like traps, especially after Silas's knowing stare. The study? Hemlock would expect that. The front door? Locked and bolted undoubtedly, and finding the right keys under duress seemed impossible. Her eyes fell on the wide archway leading towards the refectory, the scene of yesterday's unnerving encounter with the children. It was a large room, perhaps with other exits, maybe leading to kitchens or pantries. It was a gamble, but staying in the open hall was suicide. Without hesitation, she darted towards the refectory archway, praying it offered some chance of escape or concealment. She could hear Hemlock entering the main hall behind her, the lantern casting swinging shadows. "You cannot hide from your calibration, Miss Vance," the matron's voice echoed, closer now. Eleanor pushed through the swinging door into the refectory just as she heard a soft click from behind her in the hall. The sound of a lock engaging? Had Hemlock locked the door connecting the service corridor to the main house, trapping them both in this section? Or worse, trapping Eleanor in? The refectory was as cold and vast as she remembered, the long tables stretching like skeletal fingers in the gloomy morning light filtering through the high, stained glass windows. The room was empty, silent save for her own ragged breathing. She ran between the tables, heading for the far end, hoping for a kitchen door, a pantry, anything. Halfway across the room, she skidded to a halt, standing silently by the far wall. Near the door she assumed led to the kitchens were two figures, Silas and Lila. They weren't looking at her, but the main entrance through which she had just burst. They stood unervingly still, side by side, their expressions unreadable in the dim light. The low humming Eleanor associated with them seemed palpable in the air, a counterpoint to the matron's approaching footsteps. Were they here to help, or to block her escape? The swinging door from the hall burst open, and Matron Hemlock strode in, the lantern held high, her eyes immediately locking onto Eleanor across the vast room. She saw the children then, her expression flickering for a fraction of a second. Surprise? Annoyance? Before settling back into cold fury. "Children," Hemlock commanded, her voice sharp. "Return to your lessons. This does not concern you." Neither Silas nor Lila moved. They remained perfectly still, their dark eyes watching the unfolding confrontation. Silas slowly raised a hand, not towards Eleanor or the matron, but towards the center of the room, his fingers tracing an invisible pattern in the air, a spiral like the ones on the walls. Lila mirrored the gesture, her small hand trembling slightly. The ambient hum in the room intensified, the air growing heavy, charged, the light from the stained glass windows seeming to dim and warp. Eleanor felt trapped between the advancing matron and the unervingly passive children. Was this their intervention? Or were they initiating something else, something connected to the pattern, the convergence, using the conflict as a catalyst? The unmaking room might have been below, but Eleanor suddenly felt profoundly unsafe right here, caught in the heart of a power struggle far more complex and terrifying than a simple chase. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The air in the refectory grew impossibly heavy, thick as velvet, charged with a static hum that vibrated not just in Eleanor's ears, but deep within her bones, resonating with the terrifying thrum emanating from the cellar below. The weak morning light filtering through the high, stained glass windows seemed to curdle, the depictions of suffering saints warping and writhing as if the glass itself were melting. Shadows detached themselves from the corners of the room, stretching and coalescing into indistinct shapes that pulsed faintly in time with the intensifying hum. The temperature plummeted, Eleanor's breath pluming before her in icy clouds. Frost beginning to creep across the scarred surfaces of the nearest tables. Matron Hemlock faltered in her advance, her furious gaze shifting from Eleanor to the two children standing unervingly still against the far wall. Silas and Lila continued their slow, deliberate hand movements, tracing intricate, invisible spirals in the frigid air, their faces pale masks of concentration, their dark eyes reflecting the distorted, sickly light. They seemed oblivious to the cold, to the warping reality around them, utterly consumed by their task. "Stop this," Hemlock commanded, her voice strained, losing its sharp edge, tinged now with something that sounded disturbingly like fear. "You disrupt the sequence. The calibration is not yet stable. Cease." Neither child reacted to her command. The humming intensified further, rising in pitch to an almost unbearable, multi-tone drone that scraped against Eleanor's nerves like rusted metal. Dust motes dancing in the distorted light beams coalesced, forming fleeting, translucent shapes, hints of grasping fingers, hollow eye sockets, mouths stretched in silent screams, echoes of the horrifying light Eleanor had witnessed in the attic. The very air seemed to resist Hemlock's presence, pressing against her like a physical force. "I order you," Hemlock shrieked, taking an involuntary step back, the lantern shaking violently in her grasp. "The dissonance, you amplify it. You'll tear the pattern. You'll let them in." "Them?" The word hung in the frigid air, laden with terror. "Let who in?" The shadows Lila had mentioned? The things that hunger from the deep woods? Silas slowly lowered his hand, his dark eyes fixing on Matron Hemlock. The knowing, chilling smile returned to his lips. "The pattern was already torn, Matron," he said, his voice unervingly calm, mature beyond his apparent years, cutting through the oppressive hum. The offering failed. The vessel was weak, the resonance impure. He tilted his head, his gaze sharp and analytical. "Your control wanes. The nexus requires balance." Lila, beside him, began to whisper, the words indistinct but carrying a sibilant, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to weave itself into the fabric of the droning hum. As she whispered, the frost on the tables spread faster, etching complex, fractal patterns reminiscent of the symbols on the walls and the unmaking room door. The spectral shapes, swirling in the air, grew slightly more defined, their silent screams seeming to gain a horrifying, subaudible frequency that vibrated in Eleanor's skull. Hemlock stared at Silas, her face paling, naked fear finally overriding her fury. You cannot. The protocols. The unmaking," she stammered, seeming to lose her composure entirely. She glanced frantically from the children to Eleanor, then back towards the main entrance, as if seeking escape herself now. Eleanor remained frozen, halfway across the room, caught in the terrifying crossfire. This wasn't an intervention to save her. It was something else entirely. A power play, a correction orchestrated by the children themselves. They were asserting control, reacting to the matron's failure, to the imbalance she had created. And Eleanor was merely incidental. A catalyst, perhaps, but not the focus. The cold was becoming unbearable, seeping through her clothes, numbing her limbs. The pressure of the humming intensified, making her vision swim. Suddenly, one of the heavy wooden tables near the center of the room lifted several inches off the floor, hovering for a moment in defiance of gravity, before crashing back down with a sound like a thunderclap that echoed endlessly in the cavernous space. Splinters flew. Another table began to vibrate violently, its surface blurring. The spectral shapes swirled faster, converging towards Matron Hemlock, their empty eyes seeming to fix on her. Hemlock screamed then, a raw, terrified sound utterly stripped of her earlier authority. She dropped the lantern, which clattered onto the stone floor and extinguished, plunging the refectory into an even deeper gloom, illuminated only by the sickly, warping light from the high windows and the faint, internal luminescence of the swirling spectral forms. She turned, stumbling blindly back towards the main entrance, clawing at the heavy swinging door. "No, not me. The vessel, the dissonant note," she shrieked, her voice cracking, pointing a trembling finger towards Eleanor. "Take her. She is the static. Cleanse her." But the swirling shapes ignored her plea. They continued their slow, inexorable advance towards the matron, their forms becoming disturbingly more solid, coalescing into shadowy figures with too many limbs and faces composed of shifting darkness. The hum reached a fever pitch, a physical blow against Eleanor's senses. Seeing her chance, Eleanor scrambled backwards, away from the escalating chaos, away from the spectral horrors converging on the terrified matron. She bumped against the door leading towards the presumed kitchen area, her hand fumbling for a handle or latch in the near darkness. Her fingers closed around a simple thumb latch. She pushed it down. It clicked open. She cast one last look back. Matron Hemlock was backed against the main door, frantically pounding on it, her screams swallowed by the deafening drone. The shadowy figures, born of the children's ritual and the house's dark energy, were almost upon her, reaching out with claws of solidified darkness. Silas watched, his expression detached, analytical. Lila had her eyes closed, her face serene, still whispering her sibilant chant. Whatever was happening to the matron, Eleanor knew she couldn't watch, couldn't interfere. This was beyond her comprehension, beyond her ability to influence. Survival was the only imperative. She yanked the door open and stumbled through, pulling it shut behind her just as a final, blood-curdling scream echoed from the refectory, abruptly cut off by a sound like tearing fabric and crushing stone. The door slammed shut, muffling the terrifying climax, plunging Eleanor into the relative quiet and utter darkness of what appeared to be a large pantry or scullery. She leaned back against the wood, trembling uncontrollably, gasping for breath, the horrifying sound still ringing in her ears. The intense humming from the refectory faded slightly, replaced by the familiar, lower-level thrum that permeated the entire house. She was alive. She had escaped the matron, escaped the unmaking room's immediate threat. But the alternative, the raw, terrifying power wielded by Silas and Lila, the spectral horrors they had seemingly summoned or unleashed, was arguably worse. They hadn't saved her. They had simply eliminated the immediate obstacle to whatever dark purpose they, or the shadows they served, intended. And Matron Hemlock's final, desperate plea, "Take her. She is the static," echoed ominously. Had the children simply postponed her cleansing? The felt doll in her pocket seemed to pulse with a faint coldness. Soon, she was still trapped within St. Augustine's, trapped with children who were not children, who wielded terrifying power, who spoke of offerings and patterns and nexus alignments. Children born of shadow, fed by fear. Her fear, the matron's fear. Fear was the currency here, the fuel for the encroaching darkness. And Eleanor knew, with chilling certainty, that her ordeal was far from over. She had survived the unmaking room, but she had stepped into the heart of the children's terrifying world, and the true nightmare was just beginning. Chapter 4. Born of Shadow, Fed by Fear. The darkness in the pantry was absolute. Thick and cloying, smelling of stale spices, rodent droppings, and the ever-present institutional damp. Eleanor leaned against the door, her body racked with tremors. The horrific final sound from the refectory, the scream, the sickening crunch, replaying endlessly in her mind. Matron Hemlock, for all her cruelty and fanaticism, had been terrifyingly human in her final moments. What Eleanor had just witnessed, orchestrated by Silas and Lila, felt other, ancient, cold, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. Gradually, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion, gnawing fear, and a sharp pang of hunger. She needed to move, to find somewhere safer, if such a place even existed within these cursed walls. Pushing away from the door, she fumbled blindly in the dark, her hands brushing against rough wooden shelves lined with dusty jars and cans. Further in, she found sacks of flour or grain, their contents long since spoiled or pilfered by vermin. Her eyes slowly adjusted, discerning faint outlines in the gloom filtering under the door from the refectory's warped light. The pantry was larger than she initially thought, extending back into deeper shadow. Was there another way out? A connection to the main kitchens? She moved cautiously deeper into the space, her footsteps muffled by layers of dust and debris on the stone floor. Rounding a tall stack of empty crates, she saw it, a faint rectangle of even deeper darkness against the back wall. Another door. Hope surged, fragile but persistent. She stumbled towards it, her hands outstretched. The door was rough wood, unlocked. Pulling it open revealed not an escape route, but another descent into darkness, a narrower, steeper flight of wooden stairs, clearly leading down to a lower cellar level, perhaps connecting to the main one near the unmaking room. The same cold, foul air wafted up, carrying the low, resonant hum. A dead end. Or worse, another path back towards the source of the house's power. Disappointment washed over her, cold and bitter. She slumped against the doorframe, momentarily defeated. Trapped. Every path seemed to lead back to the darkness, to the children, to the pattern they served. As she leaned there, catching her breath, her eyes scanned the pantry shelf again in the dim light. One shelf, lower down, held not jars or sacks, but a row of small, plain wooden boxes, each about the size of a shoebox. Curiosity, or perhaps a desperate need for distraction, compelled her to investigate. She knelt down, pulling one of the boxes off the shelf. It was surprisingly heavy, covered in a thick layer of dust. Wiping it away revealed no label, no markings. She lifted the simple wooden lid. Inside, nestled on faded velvet lining, were children's belongings, mundane, heartbreakingly ordinary. A small, tarnished silver locket, a worn teddy bear with one button missing, a handful of colorful glass marbles, a child's drawing rendered in bright crayon, depicting a smiling sun and a stick-figure family holding hands, a stark contrast to the disturbing art elsewhere in the house. Eleanor opened another box. More treasures. A chipped porcelain doll's head, a small collection of seashells, a beautifully illustrated copy of Alice in Wonderland, its cover worn smooth from handling. A third box contained a boy's penknife, a collection of bird feathers tied with string, and a diary bound in cheap imitation leather. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she opened the diary. The pages were filled with neat, childish handwriting, documenting daily life, lessons, chores, small joys, petty grievances. The early entries were hopeful, mentioning excitement about potential adoption, dreams of a family. But gradually, the tone shifted. Entries became sparser, darker. Mentions of bad dreams, of the humming, of the matron's quiet room, of friends who went away and never came back. The last entry, dated years ago, consisted of a single, frantically scrawled sentence. The walls are listening. It wants in. These weren't just random storage boxes. These were memory boxes, keepsakes of children who had passed through St. Augustine's. Children who, judging by the diary and the matron's chilling words, likely ended up as dissonant notes quieted in the unmaking room. These are the ghosts trapped in the pattern, their hopes and fears preserved in dusty boxes, while their essences perhaps fueled the house's dark energy. Nausea churned in Eleanor's stomach. How many boxes were there? How many lives consumed by this place? Suddenly, a soft scraping sound came from the pantry door leading back to the refectory. Eleanor froze, her blood running cold. Were they coming for her? She quickly replaced the lid on the diary box, slid it back onto the shelf, and scrambled backwards, seeking concealment behind the tall stack of crates near the cellar stairs. She held her breath, listening. The pantry door opened slowly. A sliver of distorted light pierced the darkness. followed by a small silhouette. It was Lila. She slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind her, plunging the pantry back into near-total darkness. Eleanor could hear the girl's soft footsteps moving hesitantly through the space. Was she looking for Eleanor? Or retrieving something? Lila stopped near the shelves, holding the memory boxes. Eleanor heard the faint sound of wood scraping against wood as Lila apparently opened one of the boxes. A few moments of silence passed, broken only by the girl's soft breathing and the pervasive hum of the house. Then Lila spoke, her voice a soft whisper in the dark, seemingly addressed to the contents of the box, or perhaps to the lingering essence of its owner. "He's quiet now," she murmured. The dissonant chord, Silas, reinforced the pattern, but the strain, it was great. A pause. The convergence accelerates. The walls grow thinner still. "You're static," it calls to the deep woods. Another pause, longer this time. "Miss Vance, she's strong static." The matron was right. But Silas, he hesitates. He sees potential, a different resonance. Eleanor remained hidden, barely daring to breathe, listening to the girl's chillingly matter-of-fact monologue. Lila wasn't just talking to herself. She seemed to be communing with the spirits, the echoes, trapped within these walls, reporting on the house's dark machinations as if discussing household chores. Lila replaced the box lid. Her soft footsteps started moving again, this time directly towards the back of the pantry, towards the door leading down to the lower cellar, and towards Eleanor's hiding place behind the crates. Eleanor pressed herself flat against the cold stone wall, praying the darkness would conceal her. Lila stopped right beside the crates, only feet away. Eleanor could smell the faint, dusty scent of the girl's woolen jumper. She could hear the soft, rhythmic intake and exhalation of her breath. She could almost feel the low hum emanating from the child. Why'd she come back here? Then Lila spoke again, her voice still a whisper, but now clearly directed towards Eleanor's hiding place. "He knows you're here," she said, her tone devoid of inflection. "Silas feels your fear. It feeds the pattern, makes it stronger." Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. How could Lila know? Had she seen her? Or was her perception, like Silas's, tuned to frequencies beyond the normal senses? "He sent me," Lila continued, still addressing the darkness where Eleanor hid. "He says the choice is yours. Become harmony or become silence. Like the others." She gestured vaguely towards the shelves filled with memory boxes. "The convergence requires alignment. Strong resonance. You disrupt, but you also resonate. Differently. A choice? Harmony or silence?" It sounded like another word for conformity or elimination. What different resonance did Silas perceive in her? Was this a genuine offer or another manipulation? "He wants to speak with you," Lila stated. "In the chapel. When the moon rises tonight. He says come alone, come willing to listen. Or, the shadows will find you before the dawn." The thin places, they open widest in the dark. The chapel, another part of the house Eleanor hadn't seen. When the moon rises. It was an ultimatum, delivered by a child who spoke of thinning walls and hungry shadows as casually as discussing the weather. Lila waited a moment, as if expecting a response from the darkness. When none came, she turned and walked silently back toward the pantry door. Her small form briefly silhouetted against the warped light before slipping back into the refectory, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click. Eleanor remained hidden for several long minutes, her mind reeling. Silas wanted to meet. He was offering a choice, however cryptic and threatening. Was it a trap? Almost certainly. But Lila's words echoed. "Come willing to listen." Or, "The shadows will find you before the dawn." Remaining hidden, starving, and terrified, seemed like a death sentence in a house where the walls listened and shadows hunted. Meeting Silas, confronting the heart of the children's power, felt equally perilous. But perhaps it was the only path forward, the only way to understand the true nature of the convergence, the pattern, and whether escape, or even survival, was possible. The memory boxes seemed to watch her from the shelves, silent testaments to the fate of those who chose silence, or had it chosen for them. The decision was hers. Harmony or silence. Listen or be found by the shadows. As the last vestiges of daylight faded outside the unseen windows of the house, Eleanor knew that when the moon rose, she would go to the chapel. She would face the children of the shadows on their own terms. The hours between Lila's chilling visitation and moonrise stretched into an eternity of cold, gnawing fear and profound isolation. Eleanor remained in the dusty pantry, the silence broken only by the relentless, low hum of the house and the frantic thumping of her own heart. Hunger gnawed at her, a physical ache compounding her mental exhaustion, but the thought of venturing out into the main house before the appointed time was unbearable. She huddled behind the crates, the memory box's silent sentinels beside her, listening to the subtle shifts in the house's rhythm as day bled into night. Faint sounds drifted from distant parts of the building, the occasional soft footfall, a door creaking open and shut, the rise and fall of the children's unsettling humming, reminders that she was never truly alone, always observed by forces she couldn't comprehend. When the first, weak beams of moonlight finally began to filter through unseen cracks and grimy windows somewhere beyond the pantry door, painting faint, ethereal lines on the thick dust coating the floor, Eleanor knew it was time. Her legs were stiff, her body aching from the cold and tension, but a desperate resolve hardened within her. She wouldn't be hunted like a frightened animal. She would face Silas, face whatever waited in the chapel, and try to understand the terrifying game being played here. Perhaps understanding was the key, if not to escape, then at least to navigating the nightmare. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself to her feet. She smoothed her clothes, feeling the reassuring bulge of the felt doll still tucked in her pocket. Lila's ambiguous gift, a reminder of the stakes. Moving quietly, she crossed the pantry and eased the door open, peering out into the refectory. The vast room was plunged into deep shadow, relieved only by the cold, silvery moonlight streaming through the high, warped windows. The scene of Matron Hemlock's terrifying demise looked unnervingly peaceful now, the heavy tables standing in neat rows, the floor swept clean of debris. There was no sign of the struggle, no trace of the spectral horrors or the matron herself. It was as if the house had simply absorbed the event, erasing it from physical reality while retaining its psychic stain. The air, however, still felt unnaturally cold, and the low hum persisted, a constant, unsettling vibration. Eleanor slipped out of the pantry, moving cautiously across the stone floor, her senses hyper-alert. Where was the chapel? She scanned the walls, looking for another doorway, perhaps one marked or set apart. Near the main entrance archway, half hidden in shadow, she spotted it. A tall, narrow door made of dark, polished wood, different from the other utilitarian doors in this part of the house. It had a simple, unadorned cross carved into the upper panel. This had to be it. Hesitantly, she approached the door. It was slightly ajar, spilling a sliver of even colder, purer moonlight onto the floor. No sound came from within. Not even the pervasive hum seemed to penetrate its threshold. Taking another steadying breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The chapel was small, intimate, and startlingly beautiful in a severe, Gothic way. Moonlight poured through a magnificent rose window set high in the far wall, its intricate tracery depicting not biblical scenes, but complex, interlocking geometric patterns and spirals that resonated disturbingly with the symbols Eleanor had seen elsewhere. The light illuminated a simple stone altar at the far end, bare except for a single, thick black candle, currently unlit. Rows of dark wooden pews faced the altar, their surfaces polished smooth by time and use. Unlike the rest of the house, the air here was still and utterly silent, the omnipresent hum strangely absent, replaced by a profound, almost unnerving sense of peace, or perhaps emptiness. The walls were bare stone, cold to the touch, absorbing all sound. Silas was waiting. He sat alone in the front pew, facing the altar, his back to Eleanor. He wasn't chanting or fidgeting. He sat perfectly still, bathed in the intricate patterns of moonlight cast by the rose window. He looked small, almost vulnerable, silhouetted against the ethereal light, a stark contrast to the calculating awareness he had projected earlier. Eleanor paused just inside the doorway, unsure whether to speak or wait. The silence felt fragile, sacred, or perhaps merely expectant. After a long moment, without turning around, Silas spoke, his voice soft, echoing slightly in the stone chapel. "Welcome, Miss Vance. Or should I call you Eleanor? Names have power here. Resonance. You can call me Eleanor," she replied, her voice steadier than she expected. She moved slowly down the central aisle, the sound of her footsteps unnaturally loud on the stone floor. She stopped a few pews behind him, unwilling to get too close. "Fear is a powerful resonance, too," Silas continued, still facing the altar. "Yours has been feeding the house since you arrived, sharpening the frequencies, accelerating things." "I didn't ask for any of this," Eleanor said, feeling a flare of defensiveness. "I came here to help." Silas finally turned, looking over the back of the pew, his face, illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the rose window, was pale and serious. The unnerving, knowing glint was back in his dark eyes, but tempered with something else. Curiosity? Weariness? Help. He considered the word. Your kind of help involves separation, removal, scattering the vessels, weakening the nexus. That is not help, Eleanor. That is damage. Damage? Look around you, Silas. This place, the things that happen here, the fear, the rituals, the unmaking room. That isn't care, it's monstrous. Monstrous is a matter of perspective, Silas countered calmly. We are different. Our needs are different. The matron, she understood the necessity of the pattern, but her methods were crude, fear-driven, imbalanced. She created dissonance through her own rigidity. What you saw was a correction, necessary for the convergence. Convergence? What is this convergence you keep talking about? Eleanor pressed, taking a step closer. Silas turned fully in the pew to face her. A time of alignment. When the walls between worlds grow thin, he explained, echoing Lila's words. When the energies of this place, this nexus point, charged by generations of sensitive souls, by the echoes in the memory boxes, by the proximity to the deep woods, reach their peak. It is a time of great power, great potential, and great danger. Danger from what? The shadows? The things in the woods? Silas nodded slowly. They are drawn to the resonance, especially uncontrolled resonance. Static, like attracts like. The matron's fear, the failed offering, it was like ringing a dinner bell for them. They hunger. They wish to breach the pattern, to consume the energy, to spill out. He gestured vaguely towards the world outside the chapel walls. Our role, the role of the vessels attuned to the nexus, is to maintain the pattern, to harmonize the frequencies, to control the convergence, channel its power, and keep the gates sealed. He spoke with such conviction, such chilling matter-of-factness, that Eleanor felt a disturbing flicker of understanding. In his twisted reality, he wasn't a monster. He was a guardian, performing a necessary, albeit terrifying, duty. And the offerings? Eleanor asked, remembering Lila's words in the attic. The boy, what were you doing to him? Strengthening the vessel, Silas replied without hesitation. The convergence requires strong conduits. Some are born with greater capacity, like myself, like Lila. Others need assistance, calibration, infusion. His eyes darkened slightly. The matron interfered before the process was complete. She feared the power transference, feared losing control. Infusion of what, Silas? Eleanor whispered, dreading the answer. Resonance. Pure nexus energy, he said, gesturing towards the stone floor beneath their feet, as if indicating a vast power source just below, drawn up through the alignment. Focused, he looked at Eleanor intently. The energy seeks vessels, Eleanor. It needs to be grounded, channeled. Unchanneled, it attracts the others. A horrifying thought occurred to Eleanor. The children in the memory boxes, the ones who were unmade, were they failed vessels? Children who couldn't handle the infusion. Silas looked away, towards the altar, his expression unreadable for a moment. Some resonances are incompatible, he admitted quietly. Some static cannot be cleansed, only silenced. It is regrettable, but necessary to protect the whole, to maintain the integrity of the pattern against the outer hungers. Outer hungers. The phrase sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. She looked at the complex patterns in the rose window, at the bare stone altar. This chapel wasn't a place of worship in any conventional sense. It was a control room, a focal point for managing unimaginable energies and holding cosmic horrors at bay, all orchestrated by children who viewed human life as mere circuitry. "Why tell me this, Silas?" Eleanor asked. "Why offer me a choice?" "Lila said you saw potential in me." Silas turned back, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and searching. "Your fear feeds the house, yes. But there is something else. A different frequency beneath the fear. A strength. A core of order. Structure." He tilted his head again. "You resonate with the pattern, Eleanor. Not as a vessel, perhaps, but as an anchor, a potential stabilizer." The matron was pure rigidity, brittle. You have flexibility, but also inherent form. It is interesting." "Interesting?" Eleanor felt a surge of anger. "My life isn't an experiment for you to observe." "Everything is an experiment," Silas countered coolly. "The pattern adapts, evolves. The convergence demands it." The matron's way failed. "Perhaps a different approach is needed, one that incorporates your resonance." He paused, letting the implication hang in the silent air. The choice Lila offered stands. "Harmonize. Work with us. Help us stabilize the pattern. Guide the convergence. Keep the shadows out. Lend your strength, your order to the nexus." "And if I refuse? What is the silence you offer?" Silas's expression hardened, the brief flicker of intellectual curiosity replaced by cold pragmatism. "Static must be eliminated, Eleanor. If your resonance cannot be integrated, it must be purged, before it attracts the hungers, before it tears the pattern from within." The unmaking room is efficient. The threat was bald, unequivocal. Cooperate, become part of their terrifying world, or be permanently silenced. Eleanor looked at the boy, perhaps 14, perhaps far older in spirit, calmly dictating the fate of worlds and casually offering her annihilation as an alternative to collaboration. "You want me to help you manage this convergence? To participate in these rituals? To accept the silencing of dissonant notes?" The idea was abhorrent, unthinkable. "We offer survival," Silas stated simply. "Alignment. Purpose within the true framework of reality. Your world outside. It is blissfully ignorant of the abysses it borders. Here, at the nexus, the truth is unavoidable. You can be part of the defense, or you can be consumed by the chaos. Either way, your static will be resolved before the peak convergence." He glanced towards the rose window, where the moon seemed to hang, impossibly large and bright. "And the peak is coming, sooner than even the matron anticipated. Perhaps," he added, a speculative glint in his eyes, "your arrival was the final catalyst." Eleanor felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her, heavier than the silence of the chapel. Cooperate with these monstrously pragmatic children, become complicit in their horrifying reality, or face certain death, either at their hands or torn apart by the shadows they claimed to hold at bay. Was there a third option? Could she somehow disrupt their pattern, stop the convergence, free the children, assuming they even wanted freedom? The risk seemed astronomical, the chances of success infinitesimal. "I need time to think," Eleanor managed, her voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded slowly, seemingly accepting her hesitation. "Time is short. The moon wanes, but the resonance climbs. Be mindful of the thin places, Eleanor, especially after dark. Your fear draws them." He stood up, turning back towards the altar, dismissing her. "Consider the harmony, Eleanor. Consider the alternative. We will know your decision by your resonance. He remained standing there, a small, still figure bathed in the cold, intricate moonlight, leaving Eleanor alone in the echoing silence of the chapel, trapped between an impossible choice and the encroaching shadows of St. Augustine's. The pattern awaited her answer. Chapter 5. The Empty Cradles. Eleanor stumbled out of the chapel's oppressive silence back into the main body of the house, the weight of Silas's impossible choice settling upon her like a physical shroud. Harmony or silence, integration or purging, the cold, pragmatic cruelty of it, delivered by a boy who should have been concerned with homework and adolescent angst, was staggering. She leaned against the cold stone wall just outside the chapel door, the pervasive hum of the house seeping back into her awareness, a low, predatory thrum that seemed to mock the chapel's stillness. Her mind raced, desperately seeking a third path, a way out of the binary trap Silas had laid. Cooperating meant becoming complicit, becoming one of them, accepting the sacrifice of dissonant notes for the sake of a horrifying pattern. Refusal meant the unmaking room, oblivion. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, a cold tide rising in her chest. Silas's warning echoed. Your fear feeds the house. Be mindful of the thin places. Your fear draws them. She had to get control, had to suppress the terror that made her a beacon of vulnerability. Taking slow, deliberate breaths, she pushed away from the wall. Hiding wouldn't work. Silas knew where she was, felt her resonance. Waiting passively meant letting the choice be made for her when the convergence peaked or when the shadows found her. She had to act. She needed information, a lever, a weakness in the seemingly invulnerable system Silas described. Where to look? The study felt compromised, likely watched. The dormitories offered little. The cellar held only death and dread. Matron Hemlock's quarters, however, perhaps the former caretaker, in her decades of managing this cursed place, had kept records beyond the official ledgers, notes revealing her own fears, her own understanding of the nexus, perhaps even contingencies or escape plans. It was a long shot, but it was somewhere to start. Recalling the basic layout from her brief tour, Eleanor navigated the shadowy corridors towards the wing where the matron's private rooms were likely located, separate from the children's dormitories. The house felt different now, more actively hostile. The moonlight slanting through the windows seemed colder, the shadows deeper, seeming to writhe with unseen movement just at the edge of her vision. The hum intensified in certain areas, creating pockets of nauseating pressure that made her temples throb. Whispers seemed to slither from the walls, indistinct, sibilant sounds that sometimes coalesced into fragments, echoes of past suffering, or perhaps something else trying to communicate, trying to lure. Hungry, Cole, let us in. She forced herself to ignore them, focusing on her goal. She found a door, slightly more substantial than the dormitory doors, but less imposing than the study, tucked away at the end of a short, quiet corridor on the second floor. It was unlocked. Hesitantly, she pushed it open. Matron Hemlock's room was surprisingly austere, reflecting her personality. A narrow bed, neatly made, a simple wooden dresser, a small writing desk, a threadbare armchair. But unlike the sterile dormitories, this room bore the imprint of long occupation. A worn Bible lay open on the bedside table. A few faded photographs stood on the dresser, stiff, formal portraits of Hemlock herself as a younger woman, almost unrecognizable without the deep lines of stress and fanaticism, standing beside stern-faced predecessors, previous caretakers of St. Augustine's. And books, not the arcane volumes of the main study, but stacks of theological texts, philosophical treatises on order and chaos, and histories of the local region, focusing heavily on folklore and legends surrounding the woods that bordered the orphanage. Eleanor moved quickly to the writing desk, its surface clear except for a blotter and an inkwell. She tried the drawers. The top one was locked. Searching the dresser yielded nothing but neatly folded, severe clothing. Where would Hemlock keep private notes, diaries? Under the mattress? Behind a loose floorboard? Her gaze fell on the bookshelf crammed with local histories and folklore. Perhaps the answer wasn't in Hemlock's personal thoughts, but in the history of the place itself. The source of the nexus Silas spoke of. She ran her fingers along the spines, pulling out a particularly old, leather-bound volume titled Whispers of Blackwood. Histories and Legends of the Ashworth Valley. The pages were brittle, smelling of dust and time. She flipped through sections detailing early settlements, conflicts with indigenous tribes, and tales of strange disappearances and unsettling phenomena centered around the deep woods, as Lila called them, long before St. Augustine's was ever built. The legends spoke of a place where the veil between worlds was thin, a place of power that could grant boons or unleash horrors, often demanding sacrifice. They mentioned standing stones, ancient groves, and areas where the ground itself seemed to hum. Then she found it, a chapter detailing the founding of the orphanage in the late 19th century by a secretive religious order, the custodians of the veil. They hadn't chosen the location randomly. They had built directly upon a site long shunned by locals, a place believed to be a focal point and nexus for the region's strange energies. The order believed it their sacred duty to act as guardians, to contain the energies and protect the world from whatever lay beyond the thin veil. Using rituals and, chillingly, sensitized individuals, children discovered with inherent psychic resonance, as living conduits and controllers. St. Augustine's wasn't just an orphanage. It was designed as a containment facility, a ritualistic engine powered by children. Matron Hemlock and Silas now were merely continuing the custodian's grim work. Tucked into the back of the book, used as a bookmark, was a folded piece of parchment, clearly much older than the book itself. Carefully, Eleanor unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map, rendered in faded ink, showing the orphanage grounds and the surrounding woods. The orphanage building itself was marked, but so was a specific location deep within the woods, labeled simply the Heart Grove. Radiating lines connected this grove to the orphanage, specifically to a point marked on the building's foundation plan labeled Foundation Stone/Primary Conduit. Another set of fainter lines radiated from the grove, leading off the map towards symbols representing standing stones scattered throughout the valley. It looked like a schematic for the entire nexus, with the orphanage acting as a control mechanism, but the source, the heart, lay out there in the woods. Could the grove be manipulated? Could the connection be severed? Was this a potential third option? Not joining Silas, not dying, but disrupting the entire system at its source? The thought was terrifying. Meddling with forces she didn't understand could unleash the very horrors Silas claimed to be containing. But it was a chance, however slim. As she stared at the map, a sudden, intense cold spot formed in the center of the room, dropping the temperature by 20 degrees in an instant. The air shimmered, coalescing into a tall, wavering column of shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom. It possessed no discernible features, yet Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of ancient hunger and malevolent intelligence radiating from it. It didn't make a sound, but a voice echoed directly inside her mind, cold and rasping, like dry leaves skittering across gravestones. Static dissonance food. It was one of them, one of the outer hungers, the shadows, drawn by her fear, by her resonance, by the thinning veil. Silas's warning slammed back into her consciousness. She had lingered too long, her fear and contemplation acting as a lure. Frozen in terror for a split second, Eleanor clutched the map and the book. The shadowy column flowed towards her, silent and inexorable. She reacted instinctively, throwing the heavy history book directly at the shimmering darkness. The book passed straight through the shadow, as if it weren't there, hitting the far wall with a dull thud. The entity didn't even pause. Eleanor scrambled backwards, fumbling with the doorknob, her fingers numb with cold and fear. The voice slithered inside her head again. Join us, unravel the pattern. Feast, it wasn't just hunger. It was temptation, offering release from the pattern, from Silas's control, through utter dissolution. She wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the corridor, slamming the door shut behind her. She didn't wait to see if it would hold. She ran, the map clutched tightly in her hand, the entity's cold mental voice echoing in her skull. Down the stairs, through the main hall, ignoring the creaks and whispers that seemed to surge around her. She headed for the only conceivable escape route now, the heavy main entrance. Locked, bolted, just as she'd feared. She rattled the handle uselessly, tears of frustration and terror stinging her eyes. Trapped. The house itself was holding her, just as Hemlock had predicted. The shadows were manifesting. Time was running out. Then she remembered the map, the Heart Grove, the foundation stone. Disrupt the system. It was insane, possibly suicidal, but it was the only path left that wasn't submission or simple annihilation. She needed to get outside, into the woods, find that grove. But how? Windows were boarded or high up. Other exits likely locked or leading back to the cellar. Her gaze fell on the archway to the refectory, the place of Hemlock's demise. But beyond it, Lila and Silas had stood near a door leading, she assumed, to the kitchens. Kitchens often had back entrances, delivery doors, ways out to the grounds. It was a desperate gamble, re-entering that room, but perhaps the only one left. Taking a ragged breath, steeling herself, Eleanor pushed through the swinging door and stepped back into the cold, moonlit expanse of the refectory, praying the way forward wasn't already blocked by the house's guardians, human or otherwise. The silence in the room felt heavy, expectant, and profoundly dangerous. The refectory was colder than Eleanor remembered, if such a thing were possible. The moonlight, slanting through the warped saints and geometric patterns of the high windows, seemed to possess a tangible chill, painting the stone floor in shades of silver and glacial blue. Silence pressed in, thick and absolute. Yet beneath it, the low hum of the house felt stronger here, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from the very stones, energized by the recent violence. There was no physical trace of Matron Hemlock or the spectral horrors, yet the air itself felt bruised, violated. Eleanor half expected to see Silas and Lila standing impassively by the far door. But the room was empty, devoid of movement save for the swirling dust motes in the moonbeams. Clutching the precious map, Eleanor forced her legs to move, crossing the vast, echoing space towards a door she prayed led to the kitchens. Every footstep seemed unnaturally loud, magnified by the cavernous acoustics and the profound silence. She kept glancing nervously towards the main entrance archway, expecting Silas or some shadowy manifestation to appear, but nothing stirred. The house seemed to be holding its breath, watching her, perhaps allowing her this desperate bid for freedom, amused by its futility. Or perhaps its attention was focused elsewhere, on the accelerating convergence Silas had spoken of. The kitchen door opened easily into a large, functional space that was a stark contrast to the oppressive order or decay elsewhere. While clearly dated, with old cast-iron stoves and worn butcher block counters, the kitchen showed signs of recent use. Pots were soaking in a deep stone sink, vegetable peelings lay on a counter, and the air held the faint, lingering smell of boiled cabbage, the children's grim staple. It felt almost normal, mundane, which was somehow more jarring than the overt horror. But even here, the low hum persisted, a steady vibration felt through the floor tiles. Eleanor scanned the room frantically. Windows above the sinks were barred, but on the far wall, past a heavy wooden preparation table, was exactly what she'd hoped for. A thick, sturdy service door, clearly designed for deliveries or staff access, complete with heavy-duty bolts and a sturdy handle. Freedom was potentially just feet away. She hurried towards it, hope flickering anew. As she passed the preparation table, her eyes caught sight of something lying on its surface, partially hidden beneath a discarded dishcloth. It was a small, leather-bound book, the diary she had seen earlier in the memory box. The one detailing a child's descent into the house's nightmare, ending with it once in. Why was it here? Had Lila left it for her, or had Silas placed it here? Another calculated move in their psychological game. A reminder of the fate awaiting those who fail to harmonize? She couldn't afford to dwell on it. Shoving the unsettling thought aside, she reached the service door. Two heavy bolts secured it top and bottom. They looked stiff, rusted. With trembling fingers, Eleanor grasped the top bolt handle. It wouldn't budge. She put her shoulder into it, grunting with effort, straining against the oxidized metal. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the chill air. The bolt groaned in protest, then scraped back with agonizing slowness, the sound echoing loudly in the kitchen. One down. She moved to the bottom bolt. This one was even stiffer. She pulled. She pushed, her muscles screaming, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind her, from the direction of the refectory, she thought she heard a faint scraping sound, different from the bolt, perhaps a footstep, or merely the house settling. Panic spurred her on. With a final, desperate heave, the bottom bolt shot back with a loud clank. Now, just the handle and the lock, likely a simple tumbler. Her fingers fumbled with the cold metal handle. Turn. Push. The door creaked open an inch, revealing a sliver of moonlit night and letting in a blast of cold. Fresh air that smelled of pine needles and damp earth. It wasn't locked. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She yanked the door open wide and stumbled out, emerging not into the front grounds, but into a narrow, neglected service yard behind the orphanage. Piles of firewood lay haphazardly stacked against the stone wall. Weeds grew thick and high between cracked paving stones, and the oppressive bulk of the building loomed over her, its few lit windows casting eerie yellow squares onto the overgrown yard. Above, the moon hung high and bright in a sky suddenly clear of clouds, seeming impossibly large, its cold light bathing everything in stark relief. She was out of the main building, at least. The air, though frigid, felt clean, untainted by the house's internal miasma of decay and fear. But the low hum was still present, perhaps even stronger out here, seeming to rise from the very ground beneath her feet, resonating with the dark wall of the woods that pressed close against the edge of the service yard, only yards away. Eleanor quickly unfolded the map, holding the ancient parchment in the bright moonlight. Its lines and symbols seemed starker, more significant under the lunar glow. The Heart Grove. It lay deep within the woods, roughly northwest of her current position, connected by those radiating lines to the orphanage's foundation. Could she find it in the dark? Guided only by this crude map and a desperate hope? She had to try. Staying here, exposed in the service yard, felt incredibly dangerous. The house loomed behind her like a sleeping predator, and the woods before her felt equally menacing, ancient and watchful. Taking a final, deep breath of the cold night air, Eleanor pushed through the tangled weeds at the edge of the yard and stepped into the treeline, plunging into the profound darkness beneath the canopy. The transition was immediate, startling. The bright moonlight was instantly swallowed by the thick, interlacing branches overhead, leaving only faint, shifting patches of silver on the forest floor. The air grew heavy, smelling of damp soil, decaying leaves, and the rich, loamy scent of ancient forest. The silence here was different from the house's oppressive quiet. It was alive, filled with the soft rustling of unseen creatures, the creak of branches, the distant hoot of an owl, and beneath it all, the persistent, grounding hum, now seemingly intertwined with the very pulse of the earth. Eleanor paused, allowing her eyes to adjust, clutching the map like a talisman. The woods felt aware, not necessarily hostile, not yet, but deeply, anciently conscious of her intrusion. She remembered Silas's words. The convergence accelerates. The walls grow thinner. She wasn't just entering a forest. She was stepping into the fringes of a nexus, the thinning veil, where the rules of reality were likely fragile, mutable. Consulting the map again in a patch of faint moonlight, she tried to get her bearings, aligning the drawing with the looming shape of the orphanage barely visible behind her. Northwest. towards the heart grove, towards a source, towards the slimmest chance of survival, or perhaps towards the very center of the nightmare. With a silent prayer she wasn't sure anyone or anything could hear, Eleanor took her first tentative steps deeper into the deep woods, leaving St. Augustine's orphanage and its terrible secrets behind her, venturing into the ancient, humming darkness where the true power resided. The empty cradles were behind her. The hungry heart of the forest lay ahead. The deep woods swallowed Eleanor whole. The darkness beneath the ancient canopy was profound, broken only by fleeting patches of moonlight that seemed to deliberately avoid illuminating the path ahead. She stumbled forward, guided more by the increasingly intense hum resonating through the ground and the crude lines on the ancient map than by sight. Twigs snapped underfoot like gunshots in the preternatural quiet. Branches clawed at her clothes and hair like skeletal fingers, and the cold air grew thick with the scent of damp earth, pine resin, and something else, a faint, metallic tang reminiscent of the orphanage, perhaps the scent of the Nexus energy itself. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. It wasn't the focused, analytical gaze of Silas, but something diffuse, ancient, and encompassing, the forest itself, perhaps, or the myriad unseen entities drawn to the thinning veil. Whispers seemed to curl around her from the rustling leaves. No longer just indistinct sounds, but coherent, tempting phrases echoing the disembodied voice from the matron's room and Lila's warnings. Lost, join the soil, unravel, sweet silence. Illusions flickered at the edge of her vision, fleeting movements between the trees that resolved into nothing. Patches of shadow that seemed to coalesce into vaguely humanoid forms before dissolving, faint lights like foxfire dancing deeper in the woods, luring her off course. She remembered Silas's warning, "Your fear draws them," and fought to maintain a desperate semblance of calm, focusing on the map, on the objective, on the rhythmic, pulsing hum that acted as a morbid compass. The terrain grew rougher, sloping downwards into hollows choked with ferns, and then rising steeply over moss-covered rocks and tangled roots that seemed deliberately placed to trip her. The hum grew steadily stronger, no longer just a vibration in the ground, but an audible, multi-layered drone that filled the air, pressing against her eardrums, making her teeth ache. It was the sound of immense, ancient power, barely contained. The air crackled with static energy, similar to the third floor and the study, raising the hairs on her arms and neck. She consulted the map again in a rare pool of moonlight. According to the faded ink, she should be close. The lines indicating the Nexus energy converged sharply just ahead. She pushed through a final curtain of thick, low-hanging branches and stopped, catching her breath, her eyes widening at the sight before her. She stood at the edge of a large, circular clearing, perfectly round, as if drawn by a compass. Unlike the surrounding forest floor, choked with undergrowth, the ground here was bare, dark earth packed smooth and hard. And in the exact center of the clearing stood the heart grove. It wasn't a grove in the conventional sense. It was a cluster of perhaps a dozen ancient, impossibly tall trees, their species unrecognizable, their bark like blackened, cracked obsidian. They grew unnaturally close together. Their massive trunks fused at the bases, their upper branches intertwining high above to form a dense, living canopy that completely blocked the moonlight, creating a pool of absolute darkness at the grove's heart. The air around the grove shimmered visibly, distorting the shapes of the trees behind it, and the humming reached an almost deafening intensity here, emanating directly from the fused trunks. This was the source, the primary conduit, the heart of the Nexus. But it wasn't just the trees. Embedded in the packed earth around the central grove, arranged in a precise geometric pattern that mirrored the rose window in the chapel, were numerous smooth, dark stones, similar to the ones Silas held, each pulsing faintly with a cold, internal light. And scattered amongst the stones, almost hidden in the gloom, were dozens upon dozens of small, crudely made wooden cradles. They lay empty, weathered, some overturned, some broken, silent testament to countless offerings or perhaps failed vessels returned to the source. Their resonance absorbed back into the nexus. The empty cradles, a graveyard of stolen potential, fueling the pattern. As Eleanor stared, horrified and awestruck by the raw, ancient power emanating from the grove, a figure detached itself from the deep shadow beneath the central trees. Tall, unnaturally thin, draped in darkness that seemed to cling to it like ragged cloth, it possessed no discernible features save for 2 points of burning, malevolent red light where eyes should be. It wasn't human. It wasn't one of the children. It felt ancient, predatory, like the embodiment of the outer hungers Silas had described. One of the shadows, drawn by the accelerating convergence, by her own disruptive resonance, waiting here at the source. The entity flowed towards her across the bare earth, silent as death, its red eyes fixed on her, radiating palpable waves of cold and utter despair. The whispering voices intensified in her mind, no longer tempting but demanding. Static must be purged, feed the void. Silence. This was it. The end of the line. No choices left, no deals to be made. Only the void, the hunger, the silence. Eleanor backed away, her hand instinctively going to the pocket where the felt doll, Lila's warning, her strange gift, was tucked. Her fingers closed around the crude figure. As she touched it, a faint warmth spread through her hand, pushing back momentarily against the overwhelming psychic cold emanating from the shadow. Hope, or perhaps just defiance, flared within her. She wouldn't be silenced. She wouldn't feed the void. She pulled the doll from her pocket, holding it before her like a shield she didn't understand. The doll itself seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light now, mirroring the stones around the grove. But its light felt different, not cold and predatory, but resilient, grounded, imbued with a spark of desperate, human defiance passed down from whatever child had crafted it. The shadow hesitated, its advance slowing, its red eyes flickering as they focused on the doll. Did it recognize the resonance? Did this small token of lost innocence, this symbol of resistance against the pattern, disrupt its own dark frequency? Eleanor didn't wait to find out. Holding the doll aloft, she turned and ran, not back towards the orphanage, but sideways, skirting the edge of the clearing, searching for any path, any weakness, any way to use the knowledge she possessed. The map was still clutched in her other hand. The foundation stone, the primary conduit. If the grove was the source, the stone within the orphanage was the control valve. Could she reach it? Could she sever the connection, disrupt the flow, starve the pattern, even if it meant unleashing chaos? It was a desperate, insane gamble, born of terror and the faintest glimmer of hope ignited by a felt doll. The shadow let out a psychic screech of rage and frustration that tore through Eleanor's mind, and resumed its pursuit, flowing across the clearing with unnatural speed. The race was on, a terrified human woman against an entity of pure darkness, played out across a nexus point vibrating on the edge of reality, with the fate of St. Augustine's, and perhaps much more, hanging precariously in the balance. The convergence was here. The final act had begun, and there we leave Eleanor, racing from the heart of the ancient grove, clutching a child's doll and a faded map, pursued by a being of nightmare. Will she reach the foundation stone? Can the pattern be broken? Or will she merely unleash the outer hungers upon the world? Is Silas's harmony the only alternative to utter dissolution? The story of the children of the shadows doesn't end here, not entirely. The convergence peaks, the choice must be finalized, the pattern will demand its due. What do you think happens next? Let me know your theories, your fears, your hopes for Eleanor down in the comments below. If this journey into the shadowed corners of St. Augustine's orphanage chilled you to the bone, if you felt the hum of the nexus and the cold breath of the deep woods, then please show your support. Hit that like button, share this story with fellow seekers of the dark, and most importantly, subscribe to the Eli Nightfall channel right here on YouTube. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next terrifying tale whispered from the shadows. Your support allows me to keep exploring these grim landscapes and bringing these nightmares to life. Until next time, try not to listen too closely to the silence. It might just whisper back,